Hello friends and welcome to episode number 5 of the Cross Pollination podcast. Before we start, a small update, just to say that the podcast can now be found on podcasting platforms such as Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts and Spotify. So all the links will be available in the description of the YouTube video and on my Facebook page, so you can navigate from one to the other. Besides, I would be really interested in knowing if you use any other platforms, so I can try to make the podcast available there as well. Also, today I'm experimenting with written footnotes because there were way too many footnotes. I think we have almost 40, and many of them are academic references. So it made more sense this way, and they are to be found in the YouTube description as well. Okay, so today I have the pleasure of introducing you to Calder Hannan. Calder is a music theory postgraduate student at Columbia University, and I first heard about him in episode number 3 of the podcast during my discussion with Dr. Olivier Lucas, who mentioned his research in passing. I contacted him via email, and as it turned out, we were both in Paris during the winter break, so it was an unexpected and nice opportunity to meet up in person, and that's just what we did. So we met up, ate the pot-au-feu that my brother cooked, and got into it. We had a super interesting long conversation. In fact, it's almost as long as a Lord of the Rings movie, so we had time to discuss a lot of stuff, including the music of bands such as Car Bomb, Meshuggah, the Dillinger Escape Plan, Between the Buried and Me, Anomalous, Bell Witch. We also talked about concepts such as heaviness, genre mixing, musical form, ear training for metal musicians, and we went also into more, I would say, meta considerations about music and music theory as a whole. We talked as well about his solo project, Florid Ekstasis. I recommend that you give it a digital spin on his Bandcamp page, and also be sure to check his Instagram because he does a lot of impromptu, interesting musical analysis there. So the links are in the YouTube description. Finally, a little word of warning. We go really fast and really deep at times into subjects and bands that we both know about and that we assume the listener is privy to as well. So in other words, there is a metric ton of information in that podcast, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask me about it or Calder, who expressly told me that he was happy to answer your interrogations or share some articles. He also said that he suspects that many theorists in the field would be ready to do the same because it's such a new community. By the way, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe if you learned something. This helps me reach other people that might be interested in that kind of stuff. As usual, if you'd like to dive deeper into any specific subject, you're welcome to check out the footnotes. And without further ado, I present to you Mr. Calder Hannan. Hello, Calder Hannan.
Hello, how are you?
Well, I'm fine. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
We just had a nice French meal and now we're ready to get into it. So,
Oh yeah, it's very tasty.
yeah. So I've been reading your stuff for the past week. I don't quite know where to start. There is a lot of stuff of ground to be covered. It's extremely interesting. I was thinking, maybe I should just start by asking you about your background and what brought you to music, metal music specifically, playing guitar and studying music theory.
Yeah. So I started listening to metal, in middle school. Started listening to Slipknot and metalcore bands and Bullet for My Valentine. Started playing guitar around the same time, and kind of kept getting into heavier and heavier stuff. And in high school, I was very lucky. I got to kind of take a few classes that let me write about metal or kind of start writing about metal, and just kind of kept going from there. In college, I wrote a bunch more, ended up doing an undergrad thesis, and then my...
At Virginia University, right?
Yep, University of Virginia in Charlottesville. And then my advisor said, if you want to do this for a living, there's people do that. So he encouraged me to apply to music theory PhD programs. I was lucky enough to get into Columbia. And so now I'm on track to do this as a career, write about metal music. So I'm at Columbia in New York City, and still writing pretty much mostly about metal. as a music theory graduate.
Okay, and you also studied physics at University of Virginia as a bachelor's degree, right?
Yeah. I kind of thought that would be my my safe backup if the music didn't work out. Or I guess I actually really, in the beginning, I thought I was going to do physics and music was just going to be kind of a side thing for fun. But then it kind of became clear that I was much better at music than at physics. So I still finished the physics degree, but ended up sticking with the music.
Okay, so you wrote your thesis, Discordant Systems, the bachelor's thesis when you were at the University of Virginia?
Yep.
Okay. And then you wrote the Between the Buried and Me master thesis at Columbia?
Yep, that's right.
All right.
Yeah.
So maybe we should start with Between the Buried and Me.
Yeah.
I feel like in general you have this. Maybe we should talk about your approach for a second. I understand that your approach is much more of a hands-on approach in the sense that metal scholarship has been a lot about autoethnographies and the cultural impact of metal, and you really focus on musical analysis, transcriptions, and like the nooks and crannies of what like the musical phenomena that are happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that comes from being a guitarist. So I've been playing this music, especially Between the Buried and Me's music, for years, and just like spending all this time learning these things, and then this kind of dissonance that develops between what I learn in kind of standard music theory classes and what I'm kind of seeing happening in this music. And there are all these things that don't line up, where like talking about how these kind of generalizations that you hear about what harmony's like in rock and what meter is like in rock and metal, and it's like, well, no, there's a lot of music that I can see that's very different from that. So it's kind of an easy way in to talking about this stuff, and that's the sort of thing that is like interesting to write about in music theory, is saying, well, we have these theories of meter and rhythm or form or whatever, but here's some music that makes you question those, and a lot of scholars have done that, especially since the kind of the rise of pop music analysis. So I kind of see myself as doing part of that, or being part of that tradition.
Okay. So would you say that you're maybe more interested in studying the edge of the liminal cases or the exceptions to the rule, or?
Yeah, I think that's kind of how my research has gone so far, definitely. And that's one of, I guess, kind of one of two approaches in music theory to put it, to oversimplify. You have people who are doing kind of corpus study type work, where you're looking at the norms and a lot of times backed up with empirical research. I think of like David Temperley is a big one for that. And then on the other hand, you kind of have people looking at these kind of boundary cases, these test cases that make you question aspects of the theory, and kind of open new doors for thinking about it. So I think, yeah, I've definitely tended to look at bands that are not so typical. I mean, whatever typical means in metal, is such a diverse and huge field of music that it's hard to say what is typical in any sense. But yeah, and I guess incidentally, that's the type of music that's been interesting to me. So it's kind of this, I guess, reinforced on both sides. I have music that I've liked for a while, and then it turns out that often that's music that doesn't fit so nicely into whatever theories there are already.
As you're saying in both your thesis, the field of musical analysis is very new, and it feels to me like you have this kind of rhizomic exploration in all directions of different aspects. So, for example, with Between the Buried and Me, you're gonna focus on different approaches to form, and then you're gonna talk about meter and tempo in the music of Car Bomb, or about harmony in like the doom metal band, Bellwitch.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's really interesting to see that you are kind of exploring all these different subjects that maybe don't exist already in the scholarship in different ways.
Yeah, and it's kind of, as in the beginning, like I'm still very early in my career, and in the beginning it was kind of just like, well, here's another album that I like that nobody's talked about, so I'm going to talk about that. And like, I mean, I started with talking about Meshuggah, which everybody's, or a lot of people have talked about. But then it was like, well, nobody's talked about Between the Buried and Me, and nobody's talked about these other bands. And it's kind of like each band, I feel like, has been able to teach me something new about how we can think about music theory, how we can think about music analysis, and the role in metal. And then as I've kind of done more and more of these, I've started thinking more about the like why I'm doing it like this. And I don't have any great answers, but I think there's also like the benefit that comes from a diversity of albums and kind of aspects of the music that you would study. That's all good. But then also I think there's a benefit to not building these kind of theoretical canons that like you have in quote unquote mainstream music theory, where it's kind of, there's like a lot of Beethoven studies, there's a lot of this kind of focus on single artists or single composers, and I think metal studies could become something like that. And it kind of, like there have been so many papers and things about Meshuggah so far, but I think, and I like with good reason, Meshuggah, there's kind of a whole lot to talk about, but I think there's a lot to be said for kind of casting a wider net and trying to represent the more of the kind of plurality and diversity that's present in metal, instead of having metal music theory folded into Meshuggah and Metallica studies.
Yeah. This is kind of, it makes me think of the pyramid that you have in discordant systems, where you have, on top of the pyramid, you have, for example, Dr. Lucas focusing on a very specific part of a song of Meshuggah, and then you would have like, Smialek focusing on an album of Meshuggah, and then Pieslak focusing on Meshuggah, and etc., all the way down to...
Yeah, exactly. And I think that kind of can stand for how... how scholarship works. You kind of build this base, and you keep kind of going finer and finer until you find something that's, new, and you can actually do justice to talking about. And so there are all these kind of very narrow analyses. But I think, it's also, at least the hypothesis I've been working on lately, or at least for like a guiding principle, is we need to build lots of these pyramids instead of just continuing to add to this one. Not flattening the diversity that exists in metal. Like, I think when you talk a lot about meter and rhythm, and hypermeter and all these like really interesting debates in Meshuggah, it kind of, you lose the opportunity to talk about other things. So yeah, I've been trying, and it feels a little bit like, I don't know, it's very exciting because there's so little of this has been talked about, like in the grand scheme of things. There's obviously a lot more now than there was 20 years ago. But it's still kind of, I feel like we're just starting to scratch the surface in terms of the analytical side of metal studies.
Okay, so talking about your master thesis, hearing form in progressive metal, Motivic return, genre borrowing, and sonata form in parallax 2 by Between the Buried and Me.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to go into this some more. It's really interesting and really insightful. You talk about the way the album is structured and motifs, different motifs, and the way they're scattered and transformed, and I mean, I wonder if you could maybe just give an overview of the album, and then I'd love to go into some of the ideas that you discuss in there, such as Odyssey form and ABAC and ABB, etc.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe just start with an overview.
Yeah, absolutely. So this album came out in 2012. That was the follow up, or Between the Bear and Me, kind of their big breakthrough progressive metal album was Colors, and then they released The Great Misdirect, and then Parallax 2 is kind of a lot of people see that as the follow up to Colors. So it's this huge 70 something minutes album, very densely packed with material. And so my thing was, I had been listening to it for years, playing a lot of it on guitar, and my thing was like, well, how does this work? Are there patterns in how the stuff is organized? Because like you can obviously hear if you spent some time with it, stuff comes back at a lot at various levels of form. So I kind of came up with and I guess kind of the bigger thing was this idea that the album is kind of meant to be listened to all together, and trying to figure out what that means in terms of kind of concrete details. So I came up with these kind of three approaches, three ways of thinking about hearing long spans of time. So first I talk about Motivic return. So basically this pattern where if you get some idea, some motive, it'll tend to come back. You hear it once early, then you hear it twice later, you hear it 3 times after that. So these things kind of keep tending to expand. And then I talked about genre borrowing. So you listen to Between the Bear and Me, you hear metalcore and progressive metal, obviously, but then also jazz and circus music and all these kind of things that are harder to place generically and definitely aren't metal. So I kind of tried to come up with a way of thinking about how that can be a structuring principle, and putting that into conversation with topic theory, which is kind of a well-established way of thinking about classical music. And then for the last one I did, one of the songs on the album kind of is very close to sonata form, or I think it makes a lot of sense to listen to as a sonata form. So, like with a theme and a second theme and a development section and then a recapitulation. So kind of talking through that, and I think that, I don't know, just kind of gave another way of thinking about musical drama over, the course of this 9-minute song. And I guess the kind of the unusual thing that I did with this was I didn't look at the lyrics, which is would be maybe the obvious starting place in a concept album like this, because there is a narrative, and part of that's because people have talked about it. The vocalist Tommy Rogers has published a book. It's still, it's not a super clear story. It's the narrative's all confused and kind of psychedelic, and it's not like watching a TV show, but there is that story. But I didn't talk about that because a lot of people have kind of spent time talking about that, not professional music theories, but fans on discussion boards online, on the BTBAM subreddit, and other places. But then also because for me, I never, listening to it for 7 years, when I sat down to write the master's thesis, I was like, all right, I should probably make a more of an effort to look at the lyrics, and it was like a complete shock to me to see what the story actually was. I don't know if I really had a story in my head, but I guess I was trying to reflect this way of hearing, where I'm hearing something that's maybe not story-like, but sustains my interest and feels like there's like a sense of purpose over the course of a 10-minute song or the full album or whatever, but it doesn't have to do with the lyrics necessarily. So that's a big roundabout way of introducing what I was talking about with this.
Yeah, so you talk more about the musical narrative, and we were talking about Motivic use, and you used this idea, I think, from Mike Candless, right?
Yeah,
Who wrote a paper about dream theater of ABAC, which is a pretty classic rock trick for writing riff.
Yeah.
Like, for example, where you have like an A part that repeats twice and two different endings.
Yeah.
So a good example of that would be Smoke on the Water, for example.
Yeah.
But he talks about ABAC amps. And so can you explain a little bit what this is and how it's different?
Yeah. So basically the short answer is you have the same idea. You have like I think you put it very well, that A 2 times through this A material with different endings. But what he talks about is that in Dream Theater's music, and this is true of a lot of progressive metal bands, the 2 different endings will be in different meters, where the first one is shorter than the second one. So you have, I mean, there are tons of examples in Dream Theater, and in a lot of bands. I'm trying to think of a super obvious one. I mean, like, it's not really a progressive metal band, but the beginning of the first track on Blood Incantation's Star Spawn, it's like 6 + 7 or something. But I mean, his paper's on Music Theory Online, so it's free to access.
Yeah.
And so that's his basic idea, and that was something that I read, and I was like, man, this is like something I know, but I never like
formalized it.
Yeah, thought to. Yeah, which I think that's like kind of the mark of good scholarship, at least for me. That like feeling of recognition of something that you never thought to say yourself.
Yeah, it's something that you know what it is, but you never put it into words.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened to me when I read about the concept that you developed, which is ABABB, where you have like it's like you call it it's like an expanding return construction.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So like, for example, in the heavy part of telos, you have such a thing where it's like you have one thing that you keep on returning to, and then every time the B part is expanding and getting longer.
Yeah. Yeah, the super clear version of that in the in Parallax 2 is in Lay Your Ghost to Rest, in the beginning of I call it the development section, but kind of right after the clean vocal, the first clean big block of clean vocals, where it's A B A B B A B B B B. And they're super short. Each one is A and B are both just like a measure long, couple beats. It's 7/8 plus like 4/8. So 7 4 7 4 4 7 4 4 4 4.
Okay.
Yeah, and so I took that as kind of like a microcosm for things that are happening in a lot of places in the album. Not quite as exact always, but you have ideas that show up, like kind of the most long-term one is basically a little bit of each song shows up in the last song in the Silent Flight Parliament, and almost all of them, when they show up in Silent Flight Parliament, they're like twice as long. Yeah, which it seems, I don't know, like, yeah, I guess it's kind of just a way of making sense of how these things tend to happen in this album.
Yeah, it feels kind of sort of a recapitulation of the whole album, and I never again, I just listened to the album through, and it's like I did not notice all these things, but now that you say it, you have this appendix in your thesis where you map out the motifs and the way they show up, among other things that we're going to talk about later. And for example, Silent Flight Parliaments features a lot of pieces of other songs. For example, a reorganized version of the riff of Telos, or the chorus from Astral Body, for example. I was really surprised to hear that, because it's the exact same thing. It's not like coincidence or anything. Yeah. So it's extremely, extremely interesting.
Yeah, and those are those things are kind of just like fun to find, and I feel grateful that I'm in a career where I can, nerd out about this album on my own and listen to it and play guitar. And I have they've published the whole tab book for it, so it's easy to kind of flip through and check if things are the same. But then also it's kind of trying to make this link between these kind of facts in the music that I can like point to in the tab book and say, oh, this riff comes back much later, and then kind of squaring that with how I'm hearing it, what the experience of what it's like to be like, oh, that riff's coming back and now we're hearing it twice. So it feels like this moment of arrival that we've been waiting for, but not knowing that we've been waiting for the whole album.
How important, we were talking about this before the podcast actually, but how important do you think is the fact that you play guitar and you played almost the whole album on guitar? How important was that to the fact that you're figuring out the album and how it works?
Super important for me. I think we were also talking about this before. There are a lot of people we talked about. Dr. Lucas, Olivia Lucas, who plays or doesn't play this stuff and has super insightful, super interesting things to say about this music, which I just find mind blowing. Because for me, I feel like it's almost a crutch. Like I have to play it on guitar to actually hear it, and to actually check if something's the same. And it's kind of, for me, it's like a shortcut. And then also it's just like when you're, it's complicated music and it's hard to memorize. And when you spend that much time like learning these songs, I feel like you kind of do all the analysis work ahead of time. And then when I go to actually write, it's like I kind of know the album well enough that I can make these connections that I wouldn't have been able to if I didn't have, the same sort of grasp of what each part sounds like. It's like you kind of like store the memory in your fingers. Like just now I was trying to remember a riff and I was like humming it and playing it like air guitar.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I don't know, I think there's some interesting stuff to say about that, the kind of embodied memory that
there is a haptic memory, and
Yeah.
I can definitely relate to that. For example, thinking when we were talking about smoking underwater,
Yeah.
I can feel it in my fingers kind of, because I usually play it with several fingers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And I think it's interesting kind of finding these boundaries between this like these kind of super high level I don't know, like high level in the sense of like talking about these abstract connections that span a really long time, and how those are kind of inextricably linked for me to these very physical memories of what it's like to play these certain riffs. And yeah, I think that's...
I mean, maybe we'll talk about that some more when we get into Carbon, because you have the whole idea of different parallaxes and how it feels to hear the album versus playing it.
Yeah.
But something else I wanted to go into is your idea of Odyssey form. I thought it was very interesting. You mentioned, so it's just like one approach that you developed about form, and you reference another scholar's research, a scholar that came up with the concept of heroic form. Yeah. Probably based on Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. Yeah. And so can you explain a little bit the difference between the two and what you meant?
Yeah. By that? So the other scholar, Scott Burnham, he's a big Beethoven scholar, and he wrote that book, Beethoven Hero. And his idea is all kind of tied up in making this these parallels between Beethoven's life and his kind of the not necessarily just the biographical facts, but also how he's been portrayed and received for all these years, and the links between that and his music. And there are a lot of similarities to what I call Odyssey form in the music of Beethoven. But I thought that talking about progressive metal was different enough that it merited a different name. And so specifically for the Odyssey form, I'm talking about, I kind of like, it's another thing where I been listening to music, and I guess it's a kind of distinction that I had made in my head and never really formalized or put into words. But I'm kind of talking about music that is starts with some sort of music and then goes through a whole lot of different riffs and, spanning different genres and textures and whatever, and then eventually comes back to that same opening music. So kind of the, loosely related to the journey of Odysseus. And so I didn't come up with like a really hard and fast way of distinguishing these, but I think there are some clear cases, like Between the Buried and Me's music often is in this type of form. And the other bands, I think like the Mars Volta, where they have these songs that go, like I'm thinking of the last song on Francis the Mute, which is 30 something minutes, and has all these riffs and solo sections and whatever, and then you finally get back. So it's like this kind of long-term journey form where you're waiting, you're like enjoying what's going on, but you're also kind of always waiting because at least once you've heard it once, that main riff or chorus or whatever is going to come back.
Yeah, I mean, the idea for me was really spot on, because when Ulysses gets back to Ithaca about 20-something years, nobody recognizes him except the dog Argos, who recognizes him and dies immediately afterwards. And when I heard the re-exposition of Astral Body in Silent Flight Parliament, which is Astral Body is the first song after the intro, and Silent Flight Parliament is the last song before the outro, and it's a re-exposition of the same thing. I was like, wow, it's the same thing. So there is this feeling of they get back to the same place, but it's changed. It's like different. And
exactly. And that's a really interesting. That's spot on. I think what you said is makes a lot of sense. I think the metaphor makes sense on more levels than I even originally intended. Because it's a lot of these. It took me a while to realize that's like, oh, that's the same riff, which was a super cool feeling. And there's some of them that are like super subtle, and they feel like, oh, they're just like kind of little Easter eggs thrown in for people who are like really paying attention. So that, and then also just the idea of Odysseus or Ulysses' journeys, like he kind of he does so many different, like kind of completely different things. There's the sirens and the Cyclops and
the witch.
Circe and the Scylla and Charybdis and the Laestrygonians and all sorts of stuff.
And Calypso.
Yep, and Aeolus, the Bag of Winds, and
oh yeah, that's right.
There's, and like you think about just kind of like, it's kind of episodic in the same way that I think this music is often kind of modular, where it's like you have one riff and then you have another riff. Maybe there's like often a transition between them, but it's kind of like you're in one place and then you're in another and then you're in another, and each one lasts for a little bit. That was what was appealing for me.
Yeah, and it creates this sense of expectation.
Yeah.
What I would like to go into as well is the second thing you mentioned, topic theory.
Yeah.
Because your contention is actually that all the different genres that are present in BTBAM's music are there for a reason, and that they have a syntactical role and a structural role. So actually that they are just not thrown in there for the heck of it, but that they structure the song and they are here to give you a feeling of where you are, like kind of a verse chorus feeling.
Yeah, exactly. So that was kind of I think you summarized that really well. I was trying to figure out ways of articulating this feeling I have where the genre that I'm hearing at a given moment in Between the Buried and Me kind of gives me an expectation for what's going to come next and what's going to come later. So kind of the most basic example of that is you hear at the very beginning, the intro, Goodbye to Everything. It's this, clean acoustic strummed guitar. And like, okay, well, it's going to turn into metal at some point. Because that's kind of how progressive metal or progressive rock even albums go. It's like, you start with some sort of intro, some sort of, ambient or, clean guitar or whatever. And then you get into the album proper. And that's true of like a lot of metal albums. You have death metal albums that start with some sort of like sampled horror movie or whatever. And then, okay, it's going to come in at the real metal's going to start in a sec. So that was kind of the most basic form. And then digging a little deeper, I started thinking about Bloom, which is kind of the outlier on the whole album. It's like this wacky psychedelic surf rock carnival music with mathcore, everything.
Yeah.
And it's like kind of thinking like, where does that come from? And then looking back, so I went and I traced like where you hear those genres at other points in the album. And you see this thing where, you get like a tiny little taste of it very early on. Depending on how strictly you're defining it, but even like as early as Astral Body, those like whole tone scale runs that you hear later in Bloom, you hear for just a couple measures, and then you hear there's kind of that organ, the organ like power chord tritones.
Yeah, on the upbeats or something.
Yeah.
Dun, dun.
Yeah. In Lay Your Ghost to Rest, and then also later in the breakdown, there's or in the development, there's like that one little section where it sounds like an organ grinder, and then you get, there are a bunch of Extremophile Elite. There's the big long percussion, I guess, is marimba or vibraphone or something. Like kind of circus music sound.
Yes.
So basically the idea is like these get longer and longer until you finally get into Bloom. And so I was kind of talking about that as genre wise, that's kind of the polar opposite of the like progressive metal that is the main thing on the album. So you have this thing, and Bloom happens kind of at the 3/4 of the way through the album. And you get this so you're kind of like moving towards it and then away from it. So it's kind of just another way of thinking about long-term form that I think is both kind of conceptually, abstractly interesting, and then also gives you like kind of these little landmarks to hear. Or it's like, I think if you listen to Between the Buried Enemies music, you will hear, they often do these like really short, like one-off departures where it's like you have this heavy guitar riff and then suddenly they play it in this weird keyboard sound for one measure, and then it goes back to the heavy guitar riff, and then songs later you get like a full song or a full riff with that keyboard thing. So I was thinking about kind of another way of linking moments together other than just like saying, oh, this is the same riff. You can say, oh, this is the same kind of sound world, this is the same genre. And I think that can be a really interesting way of hearing this music, and one that I was drawn to it too because it's kind of completely alien to mainstream music theory, again in quotes, where kind of some of the other stuff I was doing, looking at motivic return, looking at sonata form, those are kind of pretty mainstream things to do if you're going to analyze a long piece of music, if you're going to analyze a sonata or a symphony or whatever. But talking about like genre, I think that's been done less. And when it has, like with topic theory,
yeah, I think we should make that clear that topic theory is the study of different genres within the same piece of music.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so topic theory has been around for a little while. Scholars like Ratner and Kofi Agawu more recently, and I'm blanking on her name. Maybe we'll just add it in a footnote. So their idea is that in classical music, so in the music of Haydn and Mozart especially, there are all these things that people listening at the time would have clearly recognized as meaning something else. So you have like a waltz figure that suddenly crops up, or martial music, like marching music, or pastoral topic is another one, or hunting, like another big one is like horn fifths, where it's like imitating the hunting calls, and the idea is that these would kind of lend this dimension of meaning to the music that maybe scholars haven't been paying attention to because we're so far removed from the original like signifying power of those moments.
Oh yeah, that makes total sense actually, because I was the other day I was listening to the 1812 Overture by Tchaikovsky, and I guess I have kind of a schizophrenic love-hate relationship with that song because I love V for Vendetta. I love Tchaikovsky and the concept of guns in a song, but that's actually the Russian army kicking the ass of the French army in Russia, right?
Yeah.
And at some point they have this, is the French anthem that they are playing.
Yeah.
They are playing the French anthem within the thing, so that would be a good example of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly. And kind of, I think the cool thing about topic theory is it kind of makes it, I think it's very relatable thinking about pop music these days. It's like you listen to, I think of hip hop in particular, where you're sampling all these different kinds of sound worlds, and it's like that kind of has a meaning for just like everyday listeners, and it's cool because it's not like a super abstract music theory type of meaning. It's like a very accessible meaning. I mean, you get it like I think commercials even are like ads, advertisements are a good example. You hear, like classical music in advertisements now means something like, style, elegance, luxury, upper class stuff, whereas hip hop means, cool, street smart, whatever. So kind of trying to take that type of thinking, which it gets into, semiotics and sociology and culture studies more, which I didn't really dive into in my paper, but there's a ton of interesting research there.
Yeah, and it seems to me, I mean, we were talking about it earlier, but you do an amazing job at peeling all the different layers of the onion in your thesis, because you have this appendix in which you are mapping not only it reminds me a bit of Bible studies, of studying the Bible, where you have scholars mapping all the connections between different parts of the Bible in different ways. And we were talking about how you map motifs through the album, but you also came up with a tool to study these topical changes that you called RMAC, so Referential Musical Attribute Cluster, which just means like it's what like the kind of like ethos and the style of the genre at the moment. And for example, we were talking about the song Bloom, and you make the really interesting point that Bloom is kind of in the middle of the album, and it is kind of a side. It's a bit outside of the narrative in terms of lyrics, and maybe in the album in general, but it's the center when it comes to stylistic, to the styles, because they're all featured in that song, which is kind of a compilation of all the different styles that are there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of I mean, that was you're absolutely right. That was kind of one of the big things I was trying to do with my paper, is to say, like, there are a lot of ways to listen to long-term form in this album. And some of them are kind of exclusive of each other, but that doesn't mean that they can't exist at different times for different listeners. So like for Bloom, in terms of the lyrics, what it describes is like this like hallucinatory flashback that happens like before the kind of the chronologically it comes before the album, and it doesn't really mean anything in the story. But then in this other way of hearing that I develop, it can be kind of central, like a cornerstone of the album, as the kind of the place where all these other genres are borrowed from or drawn from, and where they all point to.
Okay, so talking about maybe Between the Buried and Me a little bit more, you've transcribed the whole song, Lay Your Ghosts to Rest, right? And you talk about, did I get the title right?
Yeah, I just transcribed the vocals for that one.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the guitarist has published the tabs, and the bassist too, and I didn't do the drums, so
okay.
that one was easy.
Yeah, and okay, all right. Because actually that's what I wanted to talk about. I mean, we talked about the sonata form in that song, but I wanted to talk about your transcribing things, and how maybe use that as a pivot to talk about some of your other papers. Because, for example, you've transcribed, it's a paper that is in the works, I think, the Anomalous paper
Yeah.
about, and you've transcribed omnivalent.
Yeah.
And as I was telling you earlier, when I heard the song for the first time, I had to laugh because this song is just, I mean, on first listen, it just sounds like a hermetic bundle of pure chaos and stuff in the, I mean, I don't know how fast. And so, what was your process in transcribing that thing?
So I think the transcription is kind of a really interesting, an interesting topic in metal. There are all sorts of difficulties involved, and complications. And I think there's kind of, there's an interesting, there are a lot of interesting political questions, but kind of at base, what I'm interested with is there's so much metal music that's really complicated and is written and recorded without the aid of standard notation, as far as I can tell, for a lot of it. And I think transcription is kind of a really interesting exercise in getting into that and finding kind of these seams in how notation works, how and like finding what this process is. So it's like, I don't know. And then also it's just like in more straightforward cases, I think it's really interesting to actually like see what's happening. A lot of the times I'm listening to this music and like that Anomalous album I've been listening to for, since it came out, which I think was also 2012. And I was always like, man, this is really crazy. This is insane. And I went to sit down to actually transcribe it, and it was so much more complicated than I had even thought. And what's really interesting is like there are parts of it where I think it's kind of like, in a very important sense, untranscribable. And people have talked about this a lot in ethnomusicology, where, you're transcribing someone's voice and it's the pitches and the timing and all that. It doesn't fit with
Billie Holiday and the Huang study that you cite. I thought it was super interesting because actually I was talking about it with one of my teachers, and he was like, try to transcribe that, because actually it's in completely a different rhythmical and metrical paradigm.
And that's I took a class on jazz transcription and analysis, and we had kind of each week we had a different transcription exercise, and each one was like different or difficult in a different way. And we had the Billie Holiday one, and our professor was like, good luck. This is
Which one?
Which professor?
No, which Billie Holiday song?
We did Practice Makes Perfect.
Okay.
Which is I think probably one of the easier ones if you're going to transcribe Billie Holiday.
Because we were talking about All of Me.
Okay, yeah.
And really interesting pitch-wise and rhythm-wise.
Yeah, and there's a lot of really interesting literature on that. And the essay I really like is Peter Winkler's Writing Ghost Notes, and that's about transcribing Aretha Franklin, which kind of the same stuff. But I like how he gets into the, like, even the kind of supposedly simple parts of it, like transcribing the piano and the bass and the drums. It's like it doesn't like really translate that well. It's like there are all these little things that you can't notate that accurately, but you also can't even hear, like talking about overtones and like, do you transcribe what you hear or what you think they're playing, or what, like there's parts where parts of it are masked. Do you like, I don't know, do you try and reconstruct what you think actually happened or what? So then even in addition to that, transcribing metal, I found in the Anomalous piece especially, there are these measures where it's like, I don't know what is even happening here. There's like in the transcription, I think it's like measure 19 or whatever or something. I know because I've talked about it a lot in stuff recently. But it's like I wrote it as this measure of 25/16. But like the drums and the guitars don't line up with each other that well. And this is happening so fast. So this is me listening at 10% speed, or whatever. And you can hear that stuff just doesn't line up. And it's not just like, oh, the drums are rushing a little bit or whatever, which you can hear in other stuff. It's like fundamentally they're like doing something.
Yeah, that's what you say. I think quite. You say that it's fundamentally at odds with the grid system, and that it just doesn't line up.
Yeah. That's I guess that's exactly what I meant. So, but it's like, I think I'm fascinated by these things where you have, it seems like bands, they'll just like kind of play, and then they get to this point where like they're on the grid. It's it's like still 300 beats per minute, and or I mean not quite that fast, but really fast subdivisions, and changing time signatures every measure. But it's like, it's on the grid, it's fine. But then you get to these points where it's kind of like you get the impression that they're just like, all right, here are the notes we have to get through, and like the guitarist has 18 notes and the drummer has 25, and whatever else, and we're just gonna sprint through this and meet on the other side, and then kind of line up again later. And I think that's a kind of super interesting thing that's revealed from transcribing. So that was kind of an aside. As far as the transcription process, I always transcribe with guitar. My ears aren't good enough to, I don't trust them enough to do it without guitar. And also I think it's a good check when you're transcribing guitar music, because there's stuff that you might transcribe and it's like, well, that's actually not really physically possible. Which, I mean, you never underestimate these guitarists, but there's stuff that just doesn't make sense. And so I slow it down. I use filters. You have to do, it's like I spend a lot of time listening to tiny little chunks. And I do guitars first, always. And then normally it's pretty easy to fill the drums in after that, which obviously the drums inform what you're doing. And then I do vocals last if I'm going to do them. But there's some, just like kind of also on the topic of transcription, in the car bomb stuff I was transcribing, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. But there's kind of these fundamental questions about how they make, especially how the guitarist, Greg Kubacki, how he makes these sounds, because it's like this crazy combination of pedals and axe FX and playing techniques and whatever. And like there are parts in the song I transcribed where he's playing like a minor third below what the guitar can actually play. The way that it's tuned, which he said he's tuned, and I've seen live videos and see how he's playing it. So it's like he's using this pitch shifter pedal like as part of the instrument really fluidly to like not just for sound effects and whatever, but for actually changing the pitch, which kind of I think was a big like paradigm change for me of how I'm transcribing. It's like, it really forced me to choose, am I transcribing what you're hearing? Am I transcribing what he's playing? Why does it matter what I choose? What purpose is this going to be put to? Which I think are all kind of open questions.
Yeah, I feel like there's this really interesting dynamic that you outline, in the sense that sheet music and a transcription, they look the same when you look at them, but actually one is a recipe, kind of, and it's like guidelines for how to perform it, and the other one is an after the fact translation of a phenomenon that happens in a different realm. For example, you say that the basic unit of music in like metal and jazz genres would be recording, and that makes total sense. So you have this kind of process that can only go one way. Yeah, and it's kind of like trying to fit square pegs into round holes in a way. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's like the whole premise of saying like, well, we have this music that's fundamentally recorded, and like there are plenty of bands who will write full scores like traditional looking music, but there are plenty who don't, and I think it's just like, I don't know, you have to be careful about what you're trying to get out of it, that you're not just saying, well, obviously I need a piece of written music to say anything about this, so I try to, and a lot of people have talked about this, and try to walk this line of saying, well, we can get a lot out of a transcription, like even a kind of basic transcription where you're just seeing like how the meters are changing or whatever, like the between the barometer stuff. I mean, it would be a huge project, but I don't think that would be that difficult to transcribe compared to a lot of this other stuff. And you can still learn a ton from that. But I think even you can learn even more from these situations where you're really the transcribing is like really difficult for these kind of basic reasons, not just because it's time consuming and hard to hear.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, two of my friends actually are studying acousmatic music at Concordia University in Montreal, and they have specifically designed ear training courses to hear not only the notes but also all kinds of textures and different things that are related to musical production.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what you would think, because I was also talking about Dr. Lucas about the emergence of an institutionalization of teaching metal music.
Yeah.
And so what do you think metal ear training should and could look like? Because I'd be super interested, and I'm sure many people would be interested in that as well.
That's a really interesting question. I think the thing that jumps out to me as like having played metal, primarily, like I play jazz, but I started that much later. And that was kind of like a pretty alien way of thinking for me. But the thing that jumps out to me as different, like from that I've had, especially from being in this neo soul band with people from different backgrounds, is that I'm, as a metal musician, much more comfortable with changing meters and changing tempo and all that stuff, like on a dime. Like you listen to, Dream Theater and Between the Buried and Me and whatever. It's like there's no expectation that a time signature will last for more than a single measure in most cases. So I think that would be a big part of it. I think it would be really interesting talking about guitar tone as a specific like area of metal ear training that happens kind of organically. Like I think people learn that, and it's interesting the how that relates to advertising. And you go to I guess they don't have Guitar Center and outside of the U.S. so much, but a music store where they're trying to sell you on this amp, and you flip through Guitar Player magazine or whatever. And you see all these ads and the way they describe tone. And I think there'd be an interesting project, but in more concrete terms, in terms of ear training, I think hearing what types of guitar tones work in different situations. That was something that took me a while to learn, was like, okay, this is a tone I like for practicing, but it's not going to be a great tone live. And it's going to be a different tone again if I'm going to record, where I need like, a lot less distortion and a lot, kind of uncomfortably EQ'd to record so that it'll sound good in a mix, as opposed to what will fill a certain space, as opposed to what just like sounds good in my room. So I think that would be another part of it. And then the other thing, and this is an idea I've been playing around with for a little bit, is thinking in terms of like genre ear training. And I don't know what this would look like, but I think this is kind of something that's really native to pop music in general, not just to metal, but being able to identify genre signifiers really quickly and being able to kind of be fluent in talking about those. Like you see reviews for albums, for metal albums, for whatever, and it's like, this is a post black metal, it sounds like if Deaf Heaven and just kind of going off the top of my head. But if this band and this band had a baby, and with a little bit of avant-garde jazz thrown in and whatever, and it's just like that's what they use to, and they're often, I find they're really accurate and really evocative, these like genre-based descriptions of music, of a certain band, of a certain album, and I think that would be another component of it. But yeah, that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it's something I've been wondering about a lot. Of course, trying to create your own course and develop yourself in your own personal way. as a musician who's interested in metal.
Yeah.
And it seems to me like there is this availability bias because we have in Western Europe we have this old canon and ways of studying music that is timbrally and texturally pretty fixed.
Yeah.
Because you don't have knobs on a violin to make
Yeah.
it brighter or or EQ it in some way. And so we've been stuck with these tools, and they are not the best to talk about stuff that really matters, in the sense that guitar tone. It's just like moving, like a tiny difference in guitar tone makes the phenomenology of the experience completely different. You live it in a different way.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really interesting, and it's like a field that probably will expand in coming years. I'm really excited to.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's an interesting parallel where it's like right now, I think talking about timbre and like tone is still very much in the hands of practitioners. It's in the hands of studio engineers and musicians think about it too. But theory, kind of music theory, and this is a broad generalization, doesn't really know what to do with timbre yet. And I think it's interesting because it was the same way with harmony, with pitch, with chords, where like the early music, like we call them music theory treatises now, but they were composition manuals. They were things that people were doing in order to make music. And then later that kind of starts to separate off into this thing where people are, music theorists instead of composers or performers or whatever. So I think I would, if I had to guess, there's going to be a similar type of trajectory with this, where, as we're kind of coming to terms with digital music and digital audio, and just like electrified audio in general, we have, we're like, people are learning how to use it to make music, and then later will come the ear training and the kind of formalization of how this works. I think of the book, what's it called? It's like called Metal Music Manual by Mark Minett. A lot of M's. But it's that's right. Yeah. But it's very, like detailed, like this is what happens when you place the mics this way. This is what you get with these type of speakers. This is how you isolate stuff. This is how you double track guitars. And it's not like a theory. It's like a
hands-on.
It's a like a tutorial. And he has some theory in the beginning about like what heaviness is, which I think is really interesting. But it's mostly just like, recipes and observations from working with these bands and talking to producers and stuff. So I think, it's interesting being at that moment where this stuff isn't formalized. It's not, or it is, but it's like there's no consensus. It's not like you go and you learn Roman numerals. It's kind of, there are these rules of thumb that people follow. Roman numeral, like harmony analysis I'm talking about, where it's pretty standardized.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And actually, I would like maybe to try to tie that back to Anomalous and to go back to that, because you are talking in that paper of structural density and how structural density is made of salient moments that you identify as meaning something, and the fact that they are very prevalent in a part of music. So there is like a ton of them. And it kind of relates to what we were talking about learning a genre and getting to understand that hermeneutic circle of what events come to mean and what do they foreshadow in the future. And so yeah, I'd like for you to talk about this idea that you developed for to study this song Omnivalent, and these two ideas of structural density and chunkability.
Yeah, I think this project is still in a pretty early stage, and I'm not. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, including talking to the guitarist Max Seaman, who I'll hopefully get in touch with soon. Yeah, I guess this was very much a like, this is an album I've been listening to for a while, and I have kind of very specific feelings about it that I wasn't sure how to put into words. And ideas, like, it sounds different from a lot of music I listen to, and I was trying to figure out why. And so the idea of structural density actually kind of gets away from timbre a little bit, because I was trying to set it up as something that's specifically changes of form and changes of meter, and how quickly those alternate, or not just alternate, but change between different ones. Yeah. So I guess the idea with structural density is kind of related to that Stockhausen idea, the degree of, or density of alteration, where he has this idea that music, there's always something changing in music, and for him that's, pitch or timbre, or there are all sorts of things, and things are either repeating or changing. And so my idea is kind of a more specific version of that, where I'm talking specifically about motives and I guess mostly motives, and with each motive comes its own meter and harmonic center and whatever, and saying that in Anomalous these don't repeat nearly as much, or at least in the first part of the song they don't repeat in the same way that things do in most metal. And I guess I kind of theorized my response to this as saying that these are salient changes to me, because I'm used to listening to music that, like we were talking about before, the ABAC construction, where you have, a riff and you hear it again, maybe the ending's different, maybe not, and it's kind of easy to say, okay, here's one riff, here's another. You listen to a Metallica song, and that's kind of the classic example, where it's a whole lot of riffs, but you're kind of clear where the boundaries are. And so for Anomalous, I was trying to explain a situation where that's not the case. And I think this is kind of just a starting point for this. I'm sure there's some interesting cognitive research to back this up, that I haven't read yet, or I have read and haven't put it together, just about like what makes things chunkable. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I mean, something else that you've been mentioning and that really that I'm really interested in. There is this. I mean, you said that you've been listening to that album for what, 8 or 9 years now?
Yeah.
And there is this thing in metal where songs are not designed, as in pop music maybe, to be metabolizable, to be digestible in one listen.
Yeah.
There is this, and I've always had this idea growing up as a person who's interested in metal music. Sometimes you listen to something and you understand that you don't understand it, but you somehow have this feeling that something is there to be discovered. And for example, for me, Meshuggah took like 6 or 7 years before I understood it, but I remember the day I did.
Yeah.
And I remember the song it was, and I had like this epiphany. And Smilek talks about this, and you also mentioned this idea of veridical familiarity from Euron, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah. No, I think you put that in a really nice way, that the hearing something and understanding that you don't understand it. I think that's a really cool way of thinking about it. And what you said about Meshuggah, about the epiphany, I have another paper that I wrote about them, which I didn't send to you. It's not published. I'm probably never going to publish it, but it's kind of talking about how people think about Meshuggah as a puzzle to be solved, their music, and like looking, and like I looked on a bunch of fan boards and stuff, and it's like full of people with the same story. And it resonates with my experience of like, one day they just got it. And it's like, people say, oh, I was walking around and I was walking at the tempo and I was hitting the guitar riff patterns with my hand, and I suddenly understood how it all fit together. which I think is super interesting. And I think that's true of a lot of this music, where you listen to it and it feels like kind of like a challenge or a puzzle, where you have to solve it. I think with Meshuggah, it's kind of clearer like that, because often it's pretty basic. It's like, well, I just need to figure out what this pattern is, because I know there's a pattern. I just can't grasp it. And like, for me, that's kind of how Car Bomb feels recently, where it's like, there's got to be some relationship between these two rhythms. I just need to figure out, what that is. But I think in a more general sense, that's absolutely true, where you have these albums where you don't necessarily know what's happening, and that's kind of the fun part. But at the same time, I also feel like I don't know. I feel like when I like listening to Anomalous and this album, kind of the appeal of it is that, for me, was that it's like, it's kind of going by so fast that maybe it's exactly what you're saying. Like, it's going by so fast, and it's so like I can almost learn it and predict it, but I just can't quite get it. And I know that I won't, even after transcribing it and playing parts of it. It's just like, I'm not gonna be able to. And like, I mean, the Max Seaman, when I've been talking to him, he says, don't be surprised if I can't play a lot of these riffs, because it's like recorded in these tiny little chunks, and it's this kind of cool artificial organic hybrid thing. Yeah, no, that's definitely I think kind of a central thing of listening to this music, where maybe there's two types. I think, because I remember when I was first starting to listen to metal, when I was listening to Slipknot, I would like listen to one song and I was like, man, I can't do it. This is like when I was in middle school. I was like, man, I my ears feel raw. I can't, just the screaming, it gets to me. But I was like, I know that like it's cool to keep listening to this or whatever. And then eventually you start to like actually like the music. So there's like this idea of like, oh, this is kind of out there. This is like what there I know there's something there if I put in the time. And then on the other hand, there's music that I think is like kind of immediately fun to listen to, because it's so complicated that you don't, if you're probably never gonna be able to like really follow along at a detailed level.
Yeah, like Dillinger Escape Plan, for example.
Yeah.
The fact that it's I mean, the fun part is that that you're never gonna get it, because it's made to be ungettable, kind of.
Yeah.
I think you say unnotatable.
Yeah. I think so. That's definitely true for that. Where it's like, I don't know, it's cool to be on the grid, but then it's really cool to be off the grid. Mm-hmm. And there's also this cool thing of like, the band gets it and they're like in on this secret, and you're like trying to figure it out. Like, how are they creating these things? And it's like, I remember I like go, when I was first listening to Meshuggah a lot, I'd like, spend hours with the same pattern and be like, okay, can I get it? And then like there are still some that I can't really get. And some of them are easier, some of them are not, but it's like, I still, every time I listen to the title track from the last album, The Violent Sleep of Reason, I have to like relearn that pattern, because it's so long and so in depth. And then also that's kind of the appeal of listening to like the EP, where it's like, the only way you're going to get it is to memorize it. And also In Death is Death, playing along with that guitar part. It's like, going back to Huron, one of the ideas he talks about is awe, where it's like this feeling of like figuring out or discovering that the problem is so much bigger than you ever thought it was. And this, like, he describes it as like the feeling of stepping out of a clearing and seeing that there's like a canyon and a waterfall or whatever.
And it's a part of heaviness as you theorize it. Yeah,
exactly. And so I guess it all kind of ties back together. This like lack of digestibility is all part of the same thing.
But I guess what I was alluding to, maybe it's more of a philosophical or maybe almost political, socio-political argument, in the sense that And it's also something that you mentioned at the end of your paper on Between the Buried and Me, is that prog is a way to have your cake and eat it too, in the sense that you can have highbrow and lowbrow, quote unquote, culture, whatever that means, and mix it together. And there is this feeling maybe of, I mean, that's maybe, I mean, I know that Bertrand Russell wrote about that in his like short essay in praise of idleness, or maybe Theodore Adorno. And there is this idea of like art that is supposed to be consumed as opposed to art that is supposed to be worked for. And there is this, and I was wondering what you think about this, because there is also like this quote, de gustibus non est disputando, like that you don't discuss tastes and stuff like that. And I don't know, it's not formalized in my brain. I just wanted to pick your brain about that, because there is an intersubjective reality there, and it's true that some things that I didn't like, because I put in the time and the cognitive and the willpower and everything, now I learn to like them. I wonder what you think about this. These things are not going to yield their secret without a fight.
Yeah. I think, I mean, there's a lot that's kind of seductive about that point of view. And for me, for a long time, it was like, it's morally better to be interested in this type of music, which I think I've since completely gotten rid of that thing. And I think, I don't know, there's definitely some truth to it. Like you said, it's an intersubjective reality that this music is somehow hard, and, you need to work to figure it out, whatever that means, whether that means, learning to play it, learning to tap along with it, or just like kind of being like conceptually, oh, that's what's going on. And obviously that's like kind of what I've devoted my time to doing, is like figuring these things out. But at the same time, I kind of don't like that. I don't like feeling like that's what I'm doing. I feel like it's actually so much more complicated than that. It's not like any of these things have a solution, where it's like, maybe that's another side of the having the cake and eating it too, where it's like, I feel like I should be able to simultaneously solve, like, quote unquote, solve these puzzles, and then also leave the door open for whatever experiences, or whatever other experiences they can bring. And I think also there's kind of an interesting thing where, like, and this is something I haven't even started to scratch the surface on, but I think down the road I might want to, doing ethnography more, and talking to metal fans, because I think there's a very vocal group that are, and by vocal I mean like public available stuff. Like, I'm talking about myself and, Olivia Lucas and Eric Smielek and Stephen Hudson and Guy Capuzzo and all these people who are, Brad Osborne, people who are writing about metal. And it kind of, I think we're all, I forget who said this, but we're all a self-selecting bunch, where it's like, if you're going into this line of work, you're already going to be predisposed to be thinking analytically and thinking.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to mention, you quote someone, I forgot who it is, but it's just a little phrase, but it really made me laugh. So it's a guy who says that music theorists are probably all crypto-Platonists.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to get. It's
Yeah. And I really relate to that. I'm
yeah.
like, maybe we're just looking at clouds and being like, oh, it looks like a rabbit. No, it looks like a duck. What if it's a mix of both? Like,
which, like, it's certainly fun to do that, and obviously I'm gonna keep doing that as long as there's institutional support for it, because it feels meaningful to me. But I think it's like you were saying this earlier about something else we were talking about, but you don't want to, you have to realize that, like, there are a lot of people, and like Olivia makes this point with Meshuggah, there are a lot of people who listen to it and probably don't have any interest in trying to solve it. There are people who just go to the concert and love it because it's a blast, and it's a great mosh pit. And then there are the people who are playing it, and then there are people all or like trying to solve it. And there's that guy, like King Woodchuck or something was his like Reddit or discussion like on the Meshuggah fan boards, and he was like, I solved Obsidian. There's these long cycles, and everyone made fun of him. But there's that was a really elliptical thing, but that was quoted in Eric Smielek's master's thesis, where he does the ethnography of the fan pages of like discussion boards about Meshuggah, and kind of sorting out the people who are more modernist or subscribe to more modernist aesthetics, where it's like this is avant-garde art, as opposed to the more romantic like rock people who are like, they're just playing in 4/4. It's just meant to be a good time. So I don't know where I was going before that long digression.
And there is no right or wrong answer. But, I mean, I also wanted to ask you maybe, in the style, because I think, you and me are maybe pretty much in the same boat when it comes to that, because it feels like some kind of an enigma to be investigated. But have you seen this version of Combustion with the click on YouTube? Because actually, Combustion, the song is offset by the 16th note, whole of it, and Thomas Hauke at the beginning of Combustion, he starts like counting in, but actually the song feels like, because you naturally follow the guitar, but actually there's a guy who uploaded a version of it with a click following the drums, and it's and you can just see people in the comment section just freaking out, and it's like, I never heard it that way before.
Oh really? Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. It's quite interesting, I think.
I'll have to look at that. Yeah, and that type of thing is I think super interesting for music theory to talk about, where it's like the like you said, the duck rabbit thing, the dubbit. It's kind of I study
Wittgenstein.
with with Joe Dubiel at Columbia, and he's written some cool critiques of that, and we've talked about it in various contexts, where it's like, how useful is that as a metaphor for music? And I think one of the things that his writings and his mentorship have really opened up for me are just like not selling your own experience of it short, where it's like, it's in a way it's easy to talk about the type of stuff that I talk about, because it's like it fits nicely in an academic paper. It's like, okay, here are these patterns, you get cool looking diagrams out of it, but at the same time it's like, how does that relate to what it feels like to be in the mosh pit in Meshuggah, and you can't tell which way is up, and the lights are flashing, and you like suddenly you can't tell you don't remember any of the patterns because it just sounds completely different live. So it's like there, and like everything in between, where you're like, I make all these claims about parallax too, but when I'm listening, how often do I pay attention to those, and how often is it just like going along with the music, and it's nice because I know it, and it's like just complicated enough that it's like not boring to follow along with, but not so complicated that I can never figure it out, or I don't know. I think there's just like a whole range of experiences with this music, that not only for like in the population of fans, but just like personally, there's a lot of ways of engaging with it. And it's like, I also love like Thou and doom bands and sludge bands, where it's like the metric stuff isn't like that complicated, but there's still something that's just like worth talking about there. I don't know, or maybe it's not worth talking about. Maybe that's the whole thing. It's like some of this is easy to talk about, and some of it's just like easy to feel, and it's I
remember a couple of years back making a friend of mine making her listen to Meshuggah, and she was not in the know at all, and she was like, this is not music. So that's another way of experiencing the whole thing. And I think we have a perfect segue into your carbon paper about rhythmic parallax. There is this whole introduction to Dr. Lucas' paper on the rhythms of Obzen, and how she does an amazing job at describing this kind of a dichotomy between and this like different embodied experiences and these different ways of living the music of Meshuggah, either in the pit or counting, or a mix of both, because now she's studying the way the lights and the whole engineering there like changes the experiences of people. And so you have these this short article about Lights Out and this like longer paper about car bomb and rhythmic parallax, studying the song Mordio.
Black and Battery.
Oh, sorry,
from
the
Mordio.
album Mordio. But and I wonder if you would you care to explain a little bit about explain this idea of rhythmic parallax and how it relates to what we've been talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So the basic idea is that I've kind of, and this again came out of transcribing Black and Battery, and I kind of was getting at this earlier with the Lights Out thing, which is much shorter, but I kind of had to make I realized while I was transcribing that I had to make some choices. I could write these moments as tempo changes. I could write them as tempo modulations. I could write them as at the same tempo with changing meters. And it all kind of, it wasn't clear. And there are a lot of more kind of intricate questions about how I choose to write these. And I basically came to the conclusion that each one of these is kind of equally real for different listeners. The biggest distinction being between what kind of casual listeners, like even like this is kind of how I still hear it mostly. And so that on the one hand, and on the other hand, how the band probably thinks of this music. So kind of the classic examples are in Car Bomb, you have a lot of things that sound like their tempo changes because the cymbal starts there, or there's like a new backbeat at a different tempo. But from another perspective, it's a change of grouping where it's like you're going from the cymbal hitting, like Lights Out is kind of the classic, or not classic, but one of the most straightforward examples where it's the cymbal hits every 6/16 notes, then every 5, then every 4, then every 3, and it does that a couple times. So it's like, and listening to that for the first few times, I was like, man, they're just speeding up a little bit each time, and then you kind of start digging in and slowing it down and counting along, and it turns out that there's kind of this other way of thinking about it. But it started me onto this idea where the way we normally talk about rhythm is that there's a rhythm and a meter, and you kind of, there's one correct way, and then maybe you can mishear it or whatever. Or there's like metric ambiguity where, you have some pattern in 12/8 and you can hear it, the dotted quarter having the beat or the half note having the beat or whatever. But this is kind of like at a more fundamental level, like what one person thinks is the tempo is, the meter for someone else. And then I go even further in the paper and talk about how at a micro timing level, none of these tempos are quite stable because, they're not playing with a click track, it seems. And there's all sorts of kind of the basically this idea that there is something called the rhythm and there's something called a meter and something called a tempo. Those are all problematic in this music. And then I guess the implication is that for all music, you can kind of make these claims.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You describe them as auditory hallucinations in the sense that they have a bag of tricks. So what you mentioned, moving the China symbol, which is traditionally set, and like making it sound like it's, making it mark different groupings, and then it feels like all of a sudden they are playing tuplets, and it's like at a faster tempo or at a slower tempo.
Yeah.
It's and also the 9/8 trick.
Yeah.
That they mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah. Where they have these very fast measures of 9/8 that if you're listening, it feels like the beats kind of the same, kind of steady, isochronous, not changing. But really it's 5+4. So it's like this subtle, like kind of wonkiness to it, where for them, they're thinking 9/8, but probably for a lot of listeners, and this is something that the guitarist said in an interview, specifically, it's, for the band, they're thinking 9/8, whereas, it comes across as this kind of different rhythmic thing.
Yeah. But I guess there the idea, Christopher Hasty's idea of meter as a projective process really helps, because, for example, referring to your earlier paper, Discordant Systems, you present language 1 and 2 on the one hand, and you say that like they are moving back and forth in from two different metrical paradigms, and then you take Meshuggah's Nebulous, and you say that no, this is not a tempo change because there is what you call a polymetrical cadence, and which is super interesting. But when I listen to the song, I mean, I cannot not hear a tempo change. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I can't either. And I have a couple things. One, it's man, I've come up with a lot of crazy terms.
I love it.
It's kind of, I guess you're encouraged to do that. It's like, if you can
building your own memes, your own
find something and slap a name on it. There you have an article.
But I love it because I feel like I'm in the know, because I know what you mean.
Yeah.
And it's like such a high achievement, like a hard thing to unlock polymetrical cadence. It sounds.
Yeah. And I went back and I was going to try to turn that little thing about Nebulous into one of the short articles for the Metal in Theory blog. And I actually, there are some mistakes in what I put in my undergrad thesis. Hard to catch, but the way I transcribed it and the way that a lot of people have transcribed it, because I looked at a couple transcriptions that people just put up on Ultimate Guitar, they're actually wrong. And when I went back and was like rigorously trying to check it, it's like already complicated, but it's not even as straightforward as I said it was in the thesis. So it's like,
we need another term.
Yeah, maybe the tempo did change after all. I don't know. That would be cool. That would be the only time in Meshuggah I think that I can think of that happens.
Yeah.
I need to look more in depth at that. I kind of stepped away from doing the Meshuggah stuff for a while because I felt like the market was saturated for Meshuggah studies. But
yeah, there are so many other fields to explore, and maybe this is, I mean, you can only disambiguate to a certain extent, and then it becomes but I mean, it's interesting insofar as you manage to create meaning, and so and different ways of different modalities of listening.
Yeah, and I think the coming back to the like naming stuff, it's it's like you have, if you're gonna have a discourse around this stuff, we can't just keep saying like, oh, that one moment where it does this thing and you hum it or whatever. It's like it helps to have these shortcuts, as much as it feels like you're kind of inventing quasi-scientific jargon and throwing it in there.
Yeah, I mean, just to react on that, I find it even more interesting insofar, I mean, in the sense that because it's like musical jargon based on analogies, based on music, it's even more confusing per se. If you talk about metric modulation, you're actually talking about meter, but it's a reference to harmony. And if you talk about the polymetrical cadence, it's the same thing, or harmonic rhythm, or like, I don't know, rhythmic polyphony.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. It's like this, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. It's like you're constantly bootstrapping with because there are few enough terms that refer specifically to sound. Like a lot of the metaphors that people use to talk about sound and music are spatial. You talk about it's a complicated thing, but talk about length and you talk about like forms and structures and stuff. They're normally like you're putting stuff in diagrams and you're looking at it as like a representation of time, which is kind of this fundamentally different type of thing to experience from space. So yeah, and then you're kind of making these further abstractions based on that. Yeah, I can see, I've been inside, like, quote unquote on the inside for a while, where it's like, all my friends are music theorists and make jokes about Schenker and stuff, but you realize how kind of crazy all of that is at a certain point, and it's like, well. Yeah.
Okay, talking about your paper about heaviness for a second, I thought it was super interesting too, because heaviness is a bit like groove and it's a bit like swing, and it's these things that seem to be pervasive and everywhere, and that's what we're looking for, but it's so hard to define.
Yeah.
And the contention that you make is that it is linked in some way to complexity, rhythmical complexity.
Yeah.
I'd like to know if you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what I can say is that that's definitely true for me. And that paper represents my experience where things that are heavy are often things that are harder to wrap my head around. Is kind of in a nutshell. But I think that's not by any means an exclusive, like the only way of thinking of heaviness. There's kind of the other academic tradition for discussing it. I mean, such as it is, it's not that much, but or it's not that many authors. There's not that much of a literature, but talking about it as a timbral thing, where it's like you can have just a plain guitar tone, or like just a guitar playing one power chord, and you can say that's heavy or not. So it's a timbral thing, and then also, but like
Whistler, right?
Harris Berger, I'm not sure, and Cornelia Fales, two names I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce. But they have that article, and then Mark Minot has the stuff about heaviness. So yeah, I think there's those things, and Walser also, Robert Walser has a little bit about heaviest. Not I don't know if he actually uses the word heaviness, but he's talking about kind of the same thing, expressions of power and whatever. But then I can also I can think of plenty of examples that are very heavy, like for me, that are not rhythmically complex at all. Like again, I'm thinking of Thou, or like Electric Wizard, or these like doom metal bands where it's 4/4, these kind of repetitive riffs, but it's just like you make that face when you hear it. It's like, man, that's heavy. So I think, I don't know, if anything, I was just trying to like point out one other meaning, and it's like these terms are so useful for the same reason that they're so complicated, because they apply in a lot of different situations that aren't quite the same. They're slippery, and when you try to nail them down, it doesn't really work, because you can always think of a context in which they make sense, but it's kind of a slightly different meaning. And it's like I guess you could go in and you could say, well, this is complexity heaviness as opposed to timbral heaviness or whatever, but really I don't think it works like that perceptually. I think it's kind of, they all get melded together under this one term. I mean, same with, like you said, with swing and with groove, where you have there are a lot of things that you could say groove, and they can be very different from each other. And yeah, there are a lot of people who have tried to theorize things, but there's always something left out, which isn't necessarily a problem. I think it's good to have a lot of these types of opinions, or these ways of thinking about these complex concepts.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's like it has to do with the semantic field of the word heaviness in a sense, because it's true that when I listen to, I don't know, Sleep or Electric Wizard, and when I listen to Meshuggah, the heaviness of Meshuggah, it's like, I know that I feel it's like much closer to groove. It's like a different kind of groove.
Yeah.
And it's not the same as, or even listening to Bell Witch, there is...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's not clear that these two things should be called the same way. It's a very different thing. Or even if you listen, for example, we were talking a little bit about Neo Soul, but like Jay Dilla beats, or like all these wonky grooves and stuff like that. It's like they are on a spectrum. I don't know if it's a spectrum or a 3D lattice or whatever, but it's like a different thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's you run into really interesting stuff trying to talk about those. There's like I don't know if you're familiar with Ann Danielson's work, but she's done a lot of stuff with she wrote a book about James Brown and Parliament and funk groove beats, but really cool, looking at micro timing, looking at how and these kind of how what's happening at a really small time scale problematizes all these things. It's like, who actually has the beat, if anyone, or is the beat this like extended period in time where you can put several things in? But it's like, that's groove in the same way that you have like, I don't know, like you can have I'm thinking of like Flying Lotus, you know, his work, where like beats that are programmed to sound like Jay Dilla, where it's like a machine playing it, and it's like, that's still a groove. And then I read this PhD dissertation from Jonathan Piper, where he's making the claim that in doom metal, like, it's groove based too, even though it's kind of a very different type of thing. It's not like these, like what Charles Keel calls the participatory discrepancies, you know, that theory. It's, sorry to throw a bunch of these things at you, but it's his basic idea is that everyone, like, the whole thing that makes music work is that everyone's a little bit out of time and a little bit out of tune with each other, and that's kind of where the whole magic is. He's a jazz drummer and a ethnomusicologist, but so there's kind of like all these different ways of thinking about groove, but then also just like the idea of repetition, like, can you have a groove without repetition? Yeah, I guess all this just to agree with what you're saying.
There's a Swiss piano player, jazz piano player, whose name escapes me, but he came up with that thing called the general theory of rhythm. I don't know if you heard about that. And morphing. Basically, he plays something with a drummer. He plays the same song, and he makes so for example, he plays with a swing that is somewhere between a 16th and a half note. Mm-hmm. And he will play with that. He will morph it. So throughout the song, it will gradually change, and he changes the swing. I don't know if you heard about.
Oh no, that's
a guy I would love to talk to as well.
Yeah,
but it's super interesting. Yeah. But he's not like a music. I mean, he's a musician, and he like seems to be doing music theory on the side, and he has a website about this. Super interesting stuff. And this is designed as a way to apprehend maybe more ethnic music like Gnawa, or, you know, like African, I mean, that's like from Algeria and Moroccan music, or different ways in which polyrhythmic music is subdivided in some strange way, but it doesn't make sense to think of an underlying isochronous pulse, because it's like it goes so fast, it makes no sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
you have rhythmic dissonance in the way that you talk about Krebs.
Yeah.
That was just like but actually something else I wanted to talk about that I thought was super interesting is the way you've tied heaviness by referencing some other people's research, like London's research, to natural and physical phenomena. And for example, you talk about he has all this like cognitive research based on what can count as you reference it, for example, in the carbon paper when we talk about the 9-8 trick, because you cannot feel subdivision at this space. Or for example, when you talk about the different transcriptions of Dillinger's Prancer and why it doesn't make sense because they are exceeding the 0.03 second.
Yeah, exactly. I think that that's an interesting, I don't know. I think the cognitive research should always be taken with a grain of salt, because those show kind of like average things. And obviously there are people who can distinguish rhythms much faster and whatever. But yeah, I think it's an interesting kind of neat way of making this claim, where it's like, well, the band is feeling this pulse that's faster than what the average person can feel as a pulse, or it's like uncomfortably fast for them. So they'll default to hearing it in this other way, which I think is just like, a nice kind of like cherry on top for these types of arguments that ultimately, or originally, I guess, come from my own experience and talking to other people about the music. But I'd be really interested to talk to, especially to Carbom, and they're in New York, so I hopefully in the next couple of years I'll be able to spend some real time with them. They seem to be like open to talking about music theory, which you get this kind of with musicians a lot, where they aren't so open to like talking about what they're doing. Like, you know, it's like they're giving away a secret or whatever. and Eric talks about that also in his master's thesis, where it's like Meshuggah kind of in their interviews, they're always like, it's just in 4/4, you just have to feel it. And even in the guitar lessons that they've done like on YouTube, it's like so cool to see, because they just count in and they have the click track in 4/4 and they're playing these crazy patterns, where it's like, obviously there's at some point you were thinking about this differently. Maybe now you can just feel it. But yeah, I think that's an interesting tension.
Yeah, I would be really, really surprised to learn. Of course, I mean, we're talking about qualia now and how they feel it, and there is no way of knowing that. But for example, playing rational gaze, I don't believe that you feel that in 4/4.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense. I mean, it's so...
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's like, I believe much more that you feel it in, whatever, 64/4, where it's like you feel these big sections somehow. But yeah, it's there's still a ton of stuff to be written about Meshuggah at like these really finer, much more fine-grained levels.
Mm-hmm. And you also mentioned shortly the idea of metric malleability, London's idea, that actually polymeter in itself doesn't exist because there is no way to feel both meters at the same time, and at best you can just alternate between one and the other super fast.
Yeah, which I've been kind of struggling with that idea. I think the best critique of that I've heard, and I'm not so familiar with his work, but a recent PhD grad from Columbia, Galen DeGraff, he's an organ player and a drummer, and his basic theory, or like kind of the guiding principle, is that your brain can only hear one, and this is like way oversimplifying, your brain can only hear 1 meter at a time, but your body as a whole, your feet can hear something different from your brain, if that makes sense. So you can kind of like outsource a certain timekeeping role to your feet or to your hands or whatever, which is different from what you're kind of perceiving, which like makes intuitive sense, right? You can tap your foot along playing these super complicated things, even if you couldn't count that at the same time that you're playing them necessarily. At least that's my experience. So yeah, I think there's his idea is interesting, and it's provocative, and he's done a few. Justin London has this other article about like it was meant to be like a conversation starter, but it was about how all this like rhythmic complexity and new music can't have any meaning cognitively, where it's like you have these divisions that are like performers can't really recreate and people can't really hear. So what's the point of all this? And it was like to make a distinction between like conceptual rhythms and I don't know, heard rhythm. I forget what his terms are, but I think there's that sort of cognitive research can play a really interesting role, but I think it doesn't necessarily have the final say, and it's not, in any case, it's not completely or it's not entirely complete in any case.
It reminds me of Benny Greb. He's a German jazz drummer, and he put out this instructional DVD called The Art and Science of Groove. And it's really interesting the way he describes how he's feeling, because, for example, to create groove, so if we agree on the fact that groove is just some nice rub between different rhythmic layers, he feels like, for example, he's going to pull back the snare a little bit, and he's going to rush a little bit on the kick. But he doesn't feel like a compound pulse rate subdivision, hyper complicated fractional way. He just like feels like he's pushing one thing in one direction and another thing in the other direction. Yeah,
that's interesting. It's like either the body's analog. It's not even if the brain wants to think digital.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I that's like I don't know. It makes intuitive sense, and it's like this is also something that came from my transcribing jazz stuff, where it's like there are these things like transcribing a Charlie Parker solo where you can hear kind of clearly what he's doing. He's like taking this figure and he's making it a little faster each time and fitting it into these two measures or whatever. But it's really hard to notate that because like on the grid it doesn't make sense, and kind of circling back. But like it's not that hard to make that happen with your body. So it's kind of this interesting thing where what you can do musically is kind of at odds with what notation thinks you can do. And it's not even that, like obviously notation was designed for music that was meant to be played with that kind of that push and pull, right? I mean, like you don't have metronomically precise performances of classical music or romantic music or anything. So it's like, I don't know, it's kind of this interesting, like invisible part of the whole experience.
Yeah, and going back to this idea of morphing, like we know that swing doesn't evolve linearly with tempo, because the faster you go, the less hard you're going to swing, in the sense that your swing is going to be closer to an eighth note, and it's so you're not going to keep the same ratio every single time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think they're like, I don't know. There's all sorts of interesting stuff that and this kind of also gets back to the anomalous thing and the Dillinger Escape Plan stuff that I talk about, where it's like you're playing with a group, you're synchronizing with a group, not with a metronome necessarily, and you can kind of do these things that don't make a lot of sense in, you know, whatever kind of more traditional rhythmic framework, but that are kind of make intuitive sense and make kind of bodily sense, in terms of like how you make these sounds, and you know, you see like a string quartet playing together when they're cueing each other with their bodies and all that stuff. It's all, I think it's all kind of related, and it's, yeah, metal is just like one part of this big picture of like what rhythm can be.
Yeah, and as a segue in your Bell Witch paper that you are working on at the moment, I went to see a video of them playing live, because I was wondering how the bass player was playing these bass lines, and actually it turns out that he's tapping them. But it was really interesting for me to see the role of visual cues in their music, because the drummer is lifting his hands super high, and because it's so slow, there's no way to...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that gets at like London's thing from the other direction, where for him it's, you know, 10 milliseconds, or no, 100 milliseconds is the, so a tenth of a second, that's like the fastest that most people can hear as a pulse. And then 2 seconds is the slowest that most people can hear as a pulse. And a lot of the Bell Witch stuff is like right up against that that threshold. But yeah, you see that all in a lot of metal. Like I'm thinking of Inter Arma, but there are a lot of bands that do this, where like at the end of a song they'll have it just keep slowing down, and you'll see them all look at each other, and they all. Yeah. I'm for. Because this is a podcast, I'm raising my hand and kind of looking around as if I'm the drummer, trying to cue the other musicians.
Yeah, it's like visual. It's almost like a conductor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So can you present a little bit that paper that you wrote about the harmony in Bell Witch, and maybe the album, because it's a one song album called Mirror Reaper.
Yeah.
So. Yeah,
exactly. So it's this one 83-minute song / album. It's a funeral doom band, so it's all super slow. It's about ghosts, and so basically this paper that's going to be in Metal Studies, one of the next few things I'm just finishing up my revisions for right now, but it's basically just talking about long-term harmony. So the basic idea is that you have kind of the big takeaway I have is there's this pitch class, the F, where you hear it throughout the whole album. It shows up in all these riffs. And in the beginning, it's an F over an E flat. So it's this dissonant second that sounds like it wants to resolve down to scale degree 1. And then it becomes there's a modulation to B flat, so it becomes scale degree 5. Which is kind of this hollow feeling. And then eventually at the end, there's a modulation to D flat, so it becomes the major third, and it's consonant. And I read this as kind of the a sonic analog for this for grieving, for mourning, for loss, especially because the band, their former drummer died during the recording of it. So it's like at the beginning, the F is this like the fact of loss, and in the beginning it chafes uncomfortably, and this lasts for like half the album, so for 40 minutes, and then it becomes this kind of different sound, where you have the F over the B flat. It's this hollow, kind of empty sounding thing, as I described it. And it's also, scale degree 5 as a member of both the tonic triad, so B flat minor, and also of the dominant triad, so F. I guess they do F minor, but it's kind of straddling, like a tonic resting function and a dominant, like pushing forward function. And then finally at the end, it's a consonant member of the tonic triad. So, and then I link this a little bit to Schenkerian analyses, where you have, traditional Schenkerian things will be, you're looking for a long-term 3-2-1, so scale degree 3-2-1, over the course of a piece. Whereas here you have, instead of the upper line changing, you have the lower line changing to kind of accommodate this line. It was kind of an exercise I set for myself in like thinking like, okay, how can tonal analysis, kind of more the type of analytical strategies that you use when talking about common practice music, classical music, romantic music, how can those interact with metal? So this was the result.
There is a paradox there, in the sense that I noticed that you would expect such a piece to be relatively simple harmonically, but there is the whole slowness of it that changes the way you experience the harmony. And you've been using Schenkerian tools, but also before, at the beginning of the paper, you remember you reference neo-Riemannian theory, and so it's really interesting to see how something that is that simple becomes actually very ambiguous and very hard to analyze, because it lends itself to so many different interpretations in different frameworks of music theory.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also kind of the ambiguity is a good word, because it's I think the what you said about experience is interesting, because obviously listening to something this slow and this long, it's kind of, on the one hand, it's hard to make connections between, the beginning and the end of the album, 83 minutes later, but also because, like on the other hand, because it's so slow and pretty repetitive, you sit with these sounds for a long time. Like if one beat's lasting for a second or two, and you're sitting with this, F over E flat dissonance, and it keeps coming back, I think it actually lends itself really well to these kind of long-term harmonic things, because it's like saturating your experience, and it's really like given a chance to sink in, as opposed to, in a more traditional type of Schenkerian analysis, where you might like say, all right, here's this one chord that shows up once, and that's the Kopf tone, that's the kind of the fundamental start of this whole thing, and you're picking out these kind of things that are maybe, structurally important but not as perceptually important. So I think that's it's still an interesting tension, but for different reasons in this album.
Okay, going to another subject, you have this idea of anti-groove that you talk about, I think in the paper. It's something I wanted to mention earlier, actually, but you mentioned it in the Anomalous paper, and you also mentioned it in passing in the Discordant Systems version of the Lights Out paper. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, what do you mean exactly by anti-groove, and what does this idea...
I think that this relates a lot to the types of movements that we were talking about before, where I think it can mean a couple things, but one, I think groove is often linked to repetition and entrainment, and it's kind of the idea is that you sync up with the music and it's cyclical. You expect it to keep coming back, and that gives you a time or a chance to move with it, to kind of live with it. Whereas in a lot of these music, either because it doesn't repeat or because it doesn't have an isochronous pulse, or because that pulse is obscured for whatever reason, or because the patterns are so strange, for all these reasons, it's almost as if you're not meant to move to it in the same way, which is of course a contentious claim. But I think I don't know. I think of kind of the difference between how you move to like electronic dance music, where you'd have everybody moving along kind of to the same pulse, although there's some ambiguity there, like in Mark Butler's work. He talks about that a lot. But and then there's a lot of parts of, you think about like breakdowns in metal songs, or regular, or I say regular, but thrash influenced or traditional heavy metal, where everyone's headbanging along at the same rate, as opposed to like going to a Dillinger Escape Plan show, where in these sections it's just strobes and everyone's moshing and climbing on the ceilings and whatever. So you're still moving to the music, but you're not grooving to it necessarily. You're kind of, I don't know, reflecting it's how chaotic it is, or something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a section of my master's thesis that I ended up cutting, but I hope to work on later, about movement as a way of hearing long-term form too, like different types of moshing, different types of dancing and headbanging and moving and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think there's kind of all these different types of gradations between, entrainment and more, I don't know, abstractly linked movement.
Yeah, more or less direct link between the two. There is also this idea in the way that maybe it goes back to this crypto-Platonicism that we were talking about, but the way music theorists give meaning to certain musical events. There is this idea, what you mentioned earlier, this idea of sonic analog from Zbikowski.
Yeah.
And I wonder, could you explain that a little bit, and the way maybe if there are strategies to derive meaning from a specific musical event in a specific environment, or
I think that Lawrence Zbikowski, his book, The Foundations of Musical Grammar, is his most recent book, but he's been very prolific and influential. But he lays out this idea that music has meaning as a sonic analog for dynamic processes. That's his phrase, where the clearest example he looks at is this solo guitar, classical guitar piece called, I think it's in Spanish, El Colibri, the hummingbird. And he basically says, like, traces out how you listen to this piece and how you kind of imagine, or it has the same shape, quote unquote, as, a hummingbird in flight. You can hear at certain points, okay, this is the hummingbird hovering in front of a flower. This is it darting from here to here, and all these different things. And then he goes and looks at more complicated examples, including stuff with gesture and dance, and links to the text, and stuff like that. So, I've found it to be a very useful way of thinking about musical meaning, which is often, very slippery and elusive, and because it kind of gives it a grounding in, like, okay, the music takes this certain shape, and this shape is similar to to this other thing that happens in life or in nature, or whatever. And then he bases that in cognitive research that's about the kind of human capacity for thinking analogies.
So you are also, we were mentioning that earlier, you're also a guitar player and you're a musician yourself.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about your different musical endeavors and especially your solo project, Florid Ekstasis.
Yeah. So I've been, like I mentioned earlier, I've been playing metal guitar for a long time. And so that was kind of the culmination of 5 or 6 years of writing and just kind of spending a lot of time. I guess what I really like in the theory really informed it. It's like I listen to a band, I kind of try and figure out what they're doing, and then I kind of try and write it myself. And obviously you can't, anything you try to write will end up sounding different. So it's kind of inevitably going to have my own spin on it. But, so yeah, that was like a big, long project. And then I started playing jazz guitar in undergrad, just taking lessons. And that was super eye-opening. I'm by no means a jazz guitarist, I wouldn't say, but I've had some really good teachers. And yeah, just completely opening my mind and as far as like what I can do on guitar. So yeah, that's been great. And I've been in a few bands. I was like in, jazz trios and new music ensembles, and I done, stuff like that. And then right now I'm in a neo soul band. We're calling it like a math soul band, because we're going to be doing cool stuff with tempo modulations and irrational time signatures and all sorts of stuff. But that's still kind of very much in progress.
There's a sort of a mystery for me. I mean, I understand the so-called rock is from the heart attitude and the fact that some musicians are not really willing to delve super deep in the music theory. And but yeah, it's weird for me that some music theorists don't seem to be so versed in playing music, and it's strange also for me that a music that is so notoriously nerdy as prog, we don't have more. Your work is not more well known and more because I feel like as a songwriter myself, I have an edge reading about your research and Dr. Lucas' research and other stuff out there, because it's really just another tool in my toolbox to conceptualize music and try to create music in different ways and stuff. And so my question is, how do you think that can help musicians? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just like speaking from my own experience, I think doing like these little exercises where I try and figure out what it is I like about a piece, which has kind of been a big part of a lot of my my writing, is like I have some album that I've liked for a while and I'm trying to figure out, articulate what it is about that makes it different or makes it fun to listen to or whatever, which I mean that's kind of a simplified way of talking about it. But yeah, and I think then the exercise of taking that and trying to turn it into music is super interesting and doesn't always like yield results that I like or that are worth pursuing. But a lot of times, like me trying to sound like Intronaut or whatever, or me trying to sound like Meshuggah, actually it doesn't sound anything like them, but it sounds like something kind of cool. And I think that's kind of a cool thing to do. And then also, I mean, like when you learn music theory in school, you have to do a lot of exercises where you're actually writing counterpoint and you're writing harmonizations and whatever. And I think just having that kind of knowledge of, there's this cool, like this is really early on, and I was like, man, I love the sound. I noticed this pattern where it's like, if I build a major chord on a perfect fifth above a minor chord, I love that sound. And it's like, of course, that's just like a dominant chord in minor. But like, when I was in early high school, I was like, man, that's the coolest thing. And knowing how to recreate that was cool. And I don't know, I think it would be really interesting. I have kind of a bunch of semi-related thoughts, but I think it would be really interesting, one, to see what like kind of level of music theory a lot of these people playing in these bands have, like these kind of well-known bands, and how they're thinking about their music, because I think it's probably often much more considered and I don't know, nerdy, for lack of a better term, than it would seem when you're just like seeing them on stage with long hair, headbanging and whatever. And I like not just prog bands. I'm thinking of like Alex Webster from Cannibal Corpse, who's been in, you know, a bunch of like Blotted Science and all these bands, and people like that. Yeah, and then another semi-related thought, I think it would be, I think there's a lot of people who have the same knowledge, the same kind of music theory knowledge, where it's like, okay, I know that if I want this sort of effect, this sort of sound, I need to put these notes on the page, or I need to do these things with my hands, with my guitar, or whatever.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a cognitive process. It can just be some tinkering around, and that's maybe what you call vernacular theory.
Yeah, exactly. That's another jargon thing, which actually I'm not the only one. It seems like there are several people who have come up who've used that term concurrently, because Olivia uses that to talk about the light show, and then there's a PhD student at Yale who's using it to talk about music theory in barbershop quartet singing and pedagogy. So there's kind of all these people who are who seem to be interested in this idea right now. But yeah, the way I have kind of been thinking about it is there are all these ways of thinking about music that traditional music theory wouldn't call music theory, but kind of do all the same things. They give names to certain things. They're explanatory, you know, whatever else. But I think there, and then on the other side, there are also people who do really have that kind of rock is from the heart attitude. And like, I think of this more with like my jazz playing, and maybe I'm just a bad jazz musician, which is probably true. But like my people, there's all this rhetoric about, you know, you have to hear it, you have to feel it, which I always was super frustrating to me, because it's like, well, what if you can't? What if you're these things, like my guitar teacher would, you know, be like, all right, here, play this, and I'd play it, and play this, and then, you know, play something like that, and it's like I can't come up with it. And it's like there's this, what I'm seeing with him is the tip of this iceberg, where he's, you know, spent his 10,000 hours learning this stuff, and a lot of it was probably not feeling it and hearing it. A lot of it was like this really kind of boring work and
Trial and error.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, I don't know, another thing, another jazz mentor teacher, he used there's a parallel in linguistics where you say you start with unconscious incompetence, where you're familiar with it. You don't know what you don't know. Then you have conscious incompetence, where you're like, man, I can tell that I don't know anything, but I still don't know anything. And then conscious competence, where you're like, you have to try really hard to make something, you know, that makes sense. And this is talking about, you know, speaking a language or playing jazz or whatever else. And then unconscious competence, where like most people, their command of their native language, you don't have to think about it to make sentences, to make things that make sense. And it's the same way with musicians. So I think there's kind of a lot of people who get to the unconscious competence level in music and in songwriting without, you know, learning names for things, learning music theory. But I think music theory is a shortcut. It's like, you know, you can have babies learn to speak a language with no problem. But if you're trying to learn a language as an adult, you have to, it helps to like learn grammar rules and, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I wonder if in another way, like to maybe make a converse point, we should not be careful what we wish for, in the sense that, I mean, there are musicians, music theorists, especially in contemporary music. I was thinking about Messiaen or about Xenakis, that like wrote treatises about the music that they're making, or maybe the growing institutionalization of jazz and the fact that there is much more money in jazz education than there is in jazz music. And in a way, I'm wondering if we should not be wary of over analysis in metal. In a way, I mean, it's gonna come. I mean, it's like a process, and it's normal and it's gradual. But I wonder. I mean, we probably are gonna. It's like everything. We're gonna gain some things and lose some other things. But yeah, it's quite exciting to be in that period of we're figuring things out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can kind of see, like we've seen it with jazz, and we're seeing it even more with kind of more closer to home from the metal perspective with rock scholarship, where now, at least like I can talk about at the graduate level, there's often an analysis of pop music class. Like there's one this coming semester at City University of New York with Mark Spicer, and they're all these kind of established rock professors, and there's still there's people starting to write these kind of quote unquote definitive books. So you have like Christopher Dahl's book about harmony, and David Temperley has a recent book, The Musical Language of Rock, where it's kind of like starting to formalize all these things. And I think it's an interesting time to be in. And like you said, you gain some things, you lose some things. Same with jazz. You get, I don't know, I imagine there are a lot more mediocre jazz musicians in the world because it's been institutionalized, where you have a lot more people given access to it, which is great. And it's I think, I don't know, I take back what I said about mediocre jazz musicians. I think that sounds judgmental, when really I mean it as it's awesome that there are people who are able to participate to whatever degree in this tradition, in this culture, and kind of discover the beauty of it. Like I never would have become or been as nearly as interested in jazz if I hadn't, had access to it at the university level. So I don't know. I think that's cool, and I think that's something that can be cool for metal, just having more people participating, not for any reason of like, oh, well, we have more people, we're going to get more metal or better metal. But I just think like, I don't know, having opportunities at various levels. Like I never had a chance to play in a high school band, and I missed out on, or I mean like in the, jazz band or whatever. And I don't know, which who cares? I played in other bands, but
Yeah, I can relate to that. I feel, I don't know if that's what you mean. I don't really have a dog in that fight myself, but I know that a criticism that I hear a lot is that jazz, for example, is becoming more and more divorced from its initial cultural premises, and that now people such as you or me, we're learning about the jazz tradition, but we're learning about not the history of it, and it's been divorced from its where it was born and what it used to mean, and the oppression it was linked to, and how it was a tool to free yourself from that, and a tool to connect people, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, there is a whole very complicated argument to be had about the links between art and culture, and what it means, and etc. You have a short part in your bachelor's thesis about the difference between pop music and art music, and whether and trying to parse whether or not extreme metal is more part of pop music or art music studies. And I wonder what you think about that now, a couple of years later, and how you think about these things and these categories.
I don't know. I think a lot of my experience as a a proto music theorist, as someone who is like becoming a music theorist, like a undergrad student who likes music a lot and is writing about it, but is not sure, what I'm going to do eventually or whatever. I don't know. But at that stage in my life, I was reacting to kind of received, or what I perceived as, I think that when you're a young music theorist, or you're outside, or you're not a music theorist, you have some kind of preconceptions about what music theory is that you get passed on, institutionally, implicitly, and it's, things like, oh, well, music theory is talking about Roman numeral analysis and talking about harmony, and then eventually you realize, oh, well, there's stuff about rhythm and whatever. And I think because of the kind of lack of access that I had to the really cool research in pop music and whatever else that was happening, I had this assumption that the pop art music divide was a much bigger, more contentious thing than it really is. Whereas really, I think, and maybe I know I'm in a little bit of a bubble at Columbia where it's like pretty liberal as far as like music theory is concerned. But I think those types of like there aren't that many people, like serious music theorists, who bat an eye if you say you study metal anymore. And I think I was kind of fighting against what I felt like was a more serious distinction than it actually is. I mean, I think, for one, there's a whole lot of literature about it and critique of it that I was unaware of this like pop art music divide, especially in ethnomusicology, that if I had read, I probably would have changed how I thought about it and how I presented it.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the paper that Dr. Lucas mentioned by Noriko Manabe about Kendrick Lamar, which is, I mean, I've had a chance to skim through it. I'd like to get into it some more, but yeah, it's really interesting because, as you said, the field of music theory has completely exploded in different directions, like technical musical analysis, spectrographs, social analysis, cultural analysis, extremely interesting stuff.
Yeah, and I think music theory is not, at least in the U.S., is not a very old academic tradition. Like having being able to get a degree in music theory, that hasn't been around for, I guess in the 60s is when it kind of really took off, and that's when you started having music theory journals. And I'm not super familiar with the history of it in other countries, but I think the kind of the strategy then was to separate itself from, is to say, okay, we're doing something different from criticism, we're doing something different from historical musicology, we're doing something different from ethnomusicology, and I think that was kind of like a political move at the time to carve a space in academia for music theory, music analysis, and I think as time has gone on, those divisions have kind of become more and more arbitrary seeming, and kind of less useful, if they were ever that useful. I mean, I'm sure they were for various reasons and for kind of distinguishing, talking about the music from talking about the people and whatever. But I think what I'm finding more and more is that my work and the work of people that I admire is kind of becoming more and more interdisciplinary, where you have people who are doing, cognitive work and coupling it with analysis and with kind of more criticism type stuff, like less technical writing, and doing ethnography and autoethnography and whatever else, cultural analysis, all that type of stuff. Which I think is another reason why this podcast is so great, because it reflects that reality where these disciplinary walls are kind of, it seems to me, I mean, what do I know? I'm a grad student, but it seems to me that there's a tendency towards, blurring these lines with really cool results.
Yeah, there is a bunch of very interesting tendencies. We were talking about them, actually mentioning them with Dr. Lucas, about interdisciplinarity, not only in scholarship, but also in music at large. The fact that people like you and me can get in touch easily and that I can get access to your work pretty straightforwardly. And also the fact that musicians are in contact with their audience in a way that was never seen before. And I feel like, I mean, a lot of the people on the internet are saying that, for example, podcasting is already a dead scene or something like that, because and I think it's just the beginning, because the fact, like, this possibility of having or listening to a conversation with something so niche, so specific, like, for example, you were referencing in your paper about Anomalous, a talk with the guitar player Max Simon that he had on a podcast with like a couple hundred views, you know. And it's so interesting to have like this, because I mean, yeah, I did not know that band, and I mean, I knew Brain Drill, the band from which Marco Pietruzzella, the drummer, was part of, and now he's part of Rings of Saturn, which is a much more famous band. But it's so interesting that in such a niche you still have content out there to be exploited, and I feel like if we just project ourselves in the future, we're gonna have more and more of that, and the flow of information is just like, it's just starting, and it's gonna become like a flood. But yeah, and it's also something we were talking about, the fact that it's both good and bad at the same time, because we have limited attention spans, and I don't know how much we can take in.
Yeah, exactly. We were saying how it's kind of, at least for me, it's a little bit anxiety inducing to know how much stuff out there is that I'll never be able to read, but you have to make your peace with that.
Yeah, it's the same with just listening, just the sheer amount of good music, or music that you want to keep track of, that comes out every week.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
Yeah.
And maybe I think we can use that to segue into the last part of of the podcast.
Yeah.
Because I would like to ask you about your favorite albums from last year, from the last decade, and favorite live act and all that kind of stuff. That, yeah, I mean, just if you could just like drop a few seeds in there for people that might be curious and want to learn more about some bands they would not necessarily have heard about in other ways, or some papers that are out there, or
so I'm sure I'm going to be forgetting stuff that I will wish that I had mentioned, but the in a way, the music that I love, that has really like stuck with me, I've written about a lot of it already, so Anomalous, Car Bomb, Meshuggah, Dillinger Escape Plan, Mirror Reaper, or Bell Witch, but that album specifically, Between the Buried and Me. As far as metal stuff, something I'm interested in lately is this kind of New York City black metal scene, especially the like avant-garde scene. So I'm thinking of bands like Crawless, who, I don't know if you know the bassist Colin Marston. Yeah, he's the bassist for that. So he.
Oh, Crawless. Yeah. Yeah, I know them, but they're from New York.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So, yeah, and he's been involved with Gorguts and with everything.
And he's also a studio engineer, right? He produces a lot of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, looking at bands, so Krallis and Yellow Eyes, and
wait, that's the guy from Behold the Octopus.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I saw them play years and years ago. It was like my third metal concert ever. In this like horrible little venue in a strip mall in suburban Virginia. Empire. It's closed now. But I mean,
I have respect for their just the fact that they are breaking so many rules at once.
Yeah. They're an interesting band. I haven't listened to them in a while. There was like that at that time, like Behold the Octopus and Psyopus. Remember them? Do you know them? They were like this weird like metalcore, but like the guitarist Chris Arp something. I forget what his full last name is. I want to say Arp Man Dude, but I think that's just his like YouTube handle or something. But he just like all this crazy whammy bar stuff. Very dissonant, angular stuff. Yeah, Behold the Octopus. He's been Colin Marston's been involved in a whole lot of stuff, and he's mixed and mastered like a ton of albums that I really like. Yeah, so them and Yellow Eyes, and then Imperial Triumphant, who are it's like wacky jazz, black metal, really kind of cool, dissonant, abrasive stuff. But yeah, just that's the other kind of branch of music that I've been interested in lately. Yeah, I've been listening to a lot of, like I said, I'm in a neo soul band, so if any metalheads are looking to listen to something like that, Hiatus Coyote completely blew my mind when I found out about them last year. So that's been fun.
And actually, I wonder if you've seen this session of Napalm, the singer from Hiatus Coyote, with the Jackson guitar, and she's dressed as like with like spikes and metal T-shirts. And she
really?
Yeah.
No, I haven't seen that.
So she looks like a thrasher from like I forgot the name of that. There is an all-female thrash band from Mexico. I forgot the name, but they're amazing. And she looks like she could be part of the band. She has a Jackson guitar, but she just plays her solo stuff, like super sweet ballads and stuff.
Yeah.
With like very melismatic,
Yeah.
melodies. But it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll link it. But
that's cool.
Really funny.
That's cool. I'll have to watch that. Yeah, I've been listening to, hip hop. I've been on like a classic metal kick. I feel like it's like I never like a lot of people either get into metal like from Metallica and Judas Priest and Iron Maiden, or they get in like I did from Slipknot and metalcore. That's been my experience.
That's funny because I'm the other guy.
Classic metal.
Yeah, classic metal, and I was like spitting on that stuff when I was 16, 17. I was like, I never listened to that core. That quote, like metal is like an apple, the core sucks. But then I realized, wait, there's some good stuff there, and then I found myself listening to deathcore and gent all day long, and just forsaking all my principles.
Yeah, well, I think you if you're going to listen to any interesting music, you have to forsake your principles at some point, probably. But yeah, so recently I've just been like listening to Metallica's albums on repeat, and then bands that sound kind of like them, or like even like older bands. Like there's this band Haunt from California who are just like sound like, I don't know, Judas Priest or something, but like cool and modern too. And then Chemists, who are this like doom.
Chemists.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I've been really digging their album. And like it's what you were saying earlier about fans interacting with musicians. I like played one of their riffs on Instagram, and the guitarist got in touch with me. He's like, "Oh, this is awesome. So nice to see people, like our stuff we play." And he told me what tuning they play in, and helping out was.
But isn't he also the guitar player for Sun?
Is he?
No, I mean I might be confused there, but I think there is some kind of overlap there.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I will double check it. But yeah, I mean, what I can say is that it's definitely interesting for me to go back to the music that I was listening to when I was 13.
Yeah.
So that would be Maiden, Arch Enemy, Metallica, all the British bands like Tigers of Pantang and stuff.
Yeah.
Because at the time I experienced it as a gestalt of like music and emotion.
Yeah.
And now I hear, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Hear the drums. Oh, that's what they're doing. Oh, that's a D beat pattern when I listen to Metallica, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's so funny. And that's a great way of putting it. The gestalt of music and emotion.
Yeah.
Because I've also recently been like going back and listening to, like even earlier, like when I listened to My Chemical Romance and Fall Out Boy and Green Day, and it's like, man, this stuff's kind of cool.
Yeah.
It's like, besides bring the nostalgia and everything.
And Bullet.
Yeah.
I was also listening to Bullet.
Yeah, but that stuff's cool. So yeah, I've been listening to that stuff. As far as I find not a lot of people have heard of Anomalous, which in my opinion that's like the best tech death metal album I've ever heard.
Especially since it came out in 2011, I think.
Yeah.
And it's like, so, I mean, knowing all that came afterwards.
Yeah.
Like these, it's very foreshadowing what's coming. I mean, they are harbingers of gent in so many ways. And
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like something that is like a mashup. I mean, it could have been released last year and he would have made sense because it would have been a mashup of different influences. But it's like the mashup arrived before the genre was even codified.
Yeah.
It's strange.
That's so funny. And that's kind of what I talk about in the paper is like these riffs that show up in the like altered form before you get the real riff. So that's funny.
Yeah, there is kind of a
yeah. That's, like people weren't ready for them then or whatever.
I like the idea that the songs themselves can be that there is like this fractal nature of foreshadowing in the music of Anomalous.
Yeah. Of course,
that is
the type of people that
that is the crypto Platonists at work right there.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Also, something that blew my mind that you talked about, we did not mention in the music of Anomalous, is the nested ABAC.
Oh yeah.
I really love that concept.
Yeah.
The ABAC of ABACs.
Yeah. And I think like they have to be thinking of it that way. I don't know.
It's less far-fetched than what we said before. Actually, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just a way to extend the structure.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like you can kind of, I mean, people do this with, studying Haydn and Mozart where you have like, okay, here's the phrase prototype and here's how they extend it and they add a measure here and whatever else and they like recompose what the basic structure must have been, which I think would be an interesting way of talking about that.
Yeah, this makes me want to experiment with the ABB of ABACs. That would look, but that might be interesting.
Yeah, I think that's probably how a lot of this stuff happens. And it's like you do that structure and then you tweak it. You say, all right, I'm gonna take this one measure out or whatever. But yeah, I think.
I mean, I don't really have completely fossilized ideas on this, but I think definitely there is something to be said with the balance between the ear and what sounds good to the ear. Otherwise, you're just you're just doing modern art in the sense that the concept is all that matters and the artifact is just like And on the other hand, still using conceptual tools to maybe do a little bit of trailblazing and find new ways of getting to. It's like a different way of getting to a place that is also interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's all like I don't know. We were talking about composition before. I feel like it's all process. It's like who cares how you get there, but it's like you just need to. At least for me, it's like you need something that'll make you write stuff and get stuff recorded and whatever, and then you can tweak it, and it's all like editing is the real thing where the magic happens. Yeah,
it's super strange because actually as a listener, a normal listener, not a nerd, but a normal listener, you don't care about the scaffolding at all.
Yeah.
You only care about the artifact, care about the building. But as a musician, that's the only thing you care about is the scaffolding, is the process of how you build your things. Like, for example, in another genre, but watching Jacob Collier's I Harm You on YouTube.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen these videos.
I've seen some of his stuff.
So he just takes like a 30-second extract from that someone sends him and he just like writes an arrangement around it. And it sounds similar to how Max Siemens describes his process in the sense that it's like 1 or 2 takes every single time, and it's just like this stream of consciousness just adding layers and layers in this additive sedimentation process.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
But then, I don't know, I mean, some other things, maybe people think for days before just writing one note.
Yeah. I don't know, like I forget what, it was about some author, I think Ian McKellen or something, but apparently he like drafts whole sentences. He's just a fiction writer, but he drafts whole sentences.
Who?
Ian McKellen.
Isn't that Gandalf?
That's similar. Maybe I'm mixing them up.
No, maybe I'm just confused.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just link it.
Yeah. It's they do have very similar names, maybe even the same name. But he like drafts whole sentences in his head and apparently never writes anything without having it. And then some people like me, I just write a whole mess of stuff and eventually kind of trim it down.
Yeah. So it's like, you have the brainstorming method, and that would be the complete opposite. And then there is it's interesting because Nietzsche said, that's one of his aphorisms, that a thought that hasn't been had while walking is worthless. So you have to walk, and if you didn't have the and I mean that makes sense in a way, because if you have thoughts by reading other people's thoughts, it's like you cannot really read on it's a dangerous activity to read and walk at the same time.
Yeah.
And then it also reminds me of this French author Flaubert, and he's famous from having this like tradition of screaming out loud every single of the phrases he would write down in his like because if it sounds good.
Yeah, that's funny.
Yeah. So that's
image.
what we were talking about. And actually, I could see in the credits of your solo album from Florid Ekstasis and Flores, right? That's the name of the album. That you are also versed into literature, and that you had like references to Hemingway, The Old Man and the Sea, and also what's this name? I don't have his name right now, but the Die Verwandlung, Kafka.
Yeah.
So, you are also into.
Yeah. That was kind of a I don't know, an exercise in putting all these things together that I, cared about. Yeah, very mopey, very, pretentious, but it was fun.
I mean, it's always hard to find a subject to write about.
Yeah.
That's a challenge for me too, because it's like I don't want to be too metaphorical and sound too pompous.
Yeah.
And drop all the 3-syllable plus words that I know.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you don't want to be too direct and too like trivial.
Yeah.
It's a hard exercise.
Yeah. And it's funny when writing metal, because it's like these people write lyrics and they're like complicated and thought out, and it's like no one can hear them.
Yeah.
Like that was my experience with the transcribing the Anomalous. It's like the lyrics are online, so you can look at them, but like I'd been listening to it for years and I wasn't hearing any of those correctly, any of the lyrics, and even with the like seeing them in front of me, it was kind of hard to parse. So it's kind of a funny thing. It's like,
yeah, me too. Following the score, I was trying to follow the lyrics, and sometimes it's a hard task.
Yeah, I had to slow it down for that. And it's like this funny thing in metal. It's like you have the like it's almost like the text is separate. Like you have like the sound of the voice, which is important, but the words aren't that important in a lot of these styles, and they just kind of like float next to the music. And they're there if you want to like engage with them and you want to look at them up. But it's not like, that's the main thing most people say when they first listen to metal. They're like, what are they saying? It's like, I don't know.
Yeah. It's like very secondary.
Yeah.
It's like something that you go into if you really like the music.
Yeah.
Like in the music. And it's very rewarding in some cases. We were talking about Botanist, but also Carcass.
Yeah.
Like Carcass, I learn a new word every single phrase,
Yeah.
And it's really, and it's like there is almost like there is like this kind of death metal lyric writing competition with like the most absurd words you can find to describe gory things.
Yeah. That's funny. And like bands like Nile, and it's like very well researched Egyptian history.
Yeah.
It's like cool.
I mean, it's also, I guess, a marketing kind of thing.
Yeah,
where,
absolutely.
And that's also, maybe we can end on that.
Yeah.
Something that I almost forgot that I wanted to tell you about, because there is this idea of paraphonography.
Yeah.
That I thought I did not know the term, but it's a very interesting way of thinking about, I would say, I mean, a lot of the things we've said so far about metal apply to music and popular music in general.
Yeah.
And this is definitely one of them, like how, because music is just like, it's a specific modality, and visual art is a different one.
Yeah.
And same with video clips and like the merch and all of the goodies and like all of the extended universe, if I can say. So I was wondering if you have thoughts about this, and how would probably be also an interesting thing to study the relationship between the visuals and the band, and also their whole behavior, ethos on stage, etc.
Yeah. I don't know if this is something, I think the main thing I can say is that I need to think more about this. And it's like, I mean, for the Bell Witch paper, it's like thinking about, like, one of the comments I got on it was that they should think about that, because they released this like official visual album with it, which is like all these kind of like old film clips, and all sorts of stuff, which there's a lot of, I think that's kind of like really rich interpretive ground. and then how they act on stage, and what their t-shirts look like and all that stuff. So yeah, I think there's a lot to say about that. I'm not sure. Yeah, like with the Between the Buried and Me, that's another interesting example, because they released that like the lyric book that actually has a lot of text that's not sung, that like fleshes out the story. So it's like there's this whole, and like these aren't like the clearest examples. The Laurie Burns, I think she co-authored a paper about paraphonography in that Steven Wilson album, The Raven Who Refused to Sing. It was just like an interesting, a more in-depth look at that. So I guess that would be an article.
So yeah, it's like, yeah, it's extremely interesting. It's a form of auto-exegesis, and it's like people like you are doing unofficial apocryphal paraphonography.
There's a good multi-syllable phrase to...
Yeah. I should save it from one of my songs.
Apocryphal
paraphonography.
Paraphonography, yeah.
Yeah, that works well on Scrabble.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Calder, thank you for coming and for spending the time with me talking about all these things. And really a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, likewise.
So yeah, that was it. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to support if you learn something. So you can subscribe to the channel, and share the videos with your friends if you think that might interest them as well. Don't forget to check out the footnotes in the YouTube description of the video. And I'll see you next time for the next episode of the Cross Pollination Podcast. And that's all for now.